Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk, a woman who witnessed the rise and fall of the House of York during one of England's most turbulent centuries. Born into royalty as the sister of two kings, Edward IV and Richard III, Elizabeth lived through the devastating Wars of the Roses, raised 11 children, and survived to see her sons become the last Yorkist threats to the Tudor throne. We'll softly explore her 60 years of life, from her birth in war-torn France to her quiet marriage in Suffolk, from her brother's dramatic reigns to the tragic fates of her ambitious sons, all while the great wheel of English history turned beneath her feet, bringing victory, loss, and ultimately survival. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which member of the York family you find most fascinating, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 15th century England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Elizabeth, later known as Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk, entered the world on a September day in the year 1444 in the ancient and storied French city of Rouen. The date marked on the cathedral register shows September 22nd, though some later chronicles would mistakenly record April 22nd. A curious error that would persist through the centuries, but on that autumn day, as the leaves began to turn golden brown along the Seine River, and the first chill of approaching winter touched the Norman air, a baby girl drew her first breath in one of the great houses of this proud city. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, rose from both banks of the Seine with its soaring Gothic cathedral, its maze of medieval streets lined with timber-framed houses, and its bustling marketplaces where merchants sold wool and wine, fine cloth and exotic spices brought from distant lands. The city had witnessed centuries of history. Vikings had sailed up the Seine to found the duchy here in the 9th century. William the Conqueror had been baptized in its cathedral. And just 13 years before Elizabeth's birth, the tragic figure of Joan of Arc had been burned at the stake in the old marketplace, her ashes scattered in the river that flowed through the city's heart. Now, in 1444, Rouen served as the administrative centre of English power in what remained of the once vast territories that England had claimed in France. The 100 Years' War, that long and grinding conflict between the crowns of England and France, was entering its final bitter phase. English holdings on the continent, which had stretched from Calais to Gascony under the warrior King Henry V, were crumbling away year by year. French armies, inspired by the memory of the Maid of Orleans and led by capable commanders, were pushing the English back toward the sea. In this atmosphere of slow retreat and mounting pressure, Elizabeth's father, Richard Plantagenet, the 3rd Duke of York, held the critical position of King's Lieutenant and Governor-General of France. He commanded English forces in Normandy, a thankless task that required military skill, diplomatic finesse, and access to resources that the Crown in London could rarely provide in sufficient quantity. Richard was a man in his early 30s, tall and strong, with the golden hair and fair complexion that marked the Plantagenet line. He possessed courage, administrative ability, and an increasingly firm conviction that he could govern England better than those currently holding power in the name of the ineffectual King Henry VI. Richard's wife, Cecily Neville, had accompanied him to France, braving the dangerous sea crossing and the uncertainties of life in a war zone to remain by her husband's side. Cecily, born in 1415, came from one of England's most powerful noble families. The Nevilles had risen to prominence through military service, advantageous marriages, and shrewd political manoeuvring. Cecily's father, Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, had fathered an astounding 22 children by 2 wives, and Cecily was the youngest of his offspring by his second marriage to Joan Beaufort. Joan Beaufort brought royal blood to the Neville family, for she was the daughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the 3rd surviving son of King Edward III, and his 3rd wife, Catherine Swynford. This connection made Cecily a great-granddaughter of King Edward III, a lineage that would prove significant in the decades to come. But Joan had been born before her parents' marriage, when Catherine was John of Gaunt's mistress, and though their children were later legitimised, a parliamentary statute had attempted to bar them from the royal succession. The validity of this restriction would become a matter of fierce debate as the century progressed. Cecily had been only 9 years old when her father betrothed her to Richard, Duke of York, who was then 13. Ralph Neville served as Richard's guardian, for the young Duke had been orphaned by tragedy and political violence. Richard's father, also named Richard, had been executed for treason in 1415 after plotting against King Henry V. The title and estates had passed to the son, but the stigma of treason had required careful management. By marrying young Richard to his daughter, Ralph Neville bound the fortunes of the York and Neville families together in an alliance that would reshape England. The marriage had been celebrated by October of 1429, when Cecily was 14 and Richard was 17. In the 17 years since their wedding, Cecily had proven remarkably fertile, bearing child after child despite the frequent moves and unsettled conditions of medieval noble life. Her first surviving child, Anne, had been born at Fotheringhay Castle in August of 1439. A son named Henry had been born in February of 1441, shortly after the family arrived in Rouen, but the little boy had died in infancy, his tiny body laid to rest far from England in Norman soil. Then came Edward, born on April the 28th, 1442, in a chamber of the castle at Rouen. This robust boy received immediate private baptism in a side chapel, following the practice of ensuring a child's soul was protected before the formal christening ceremony could be arranged. Edward would grow into an extraordinarily tall and handsome man, standing 6 feet 4 inches in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. Edmund, Earl of Rutland, followed in May of 1443, another healthy son, who would be educated alongside his older brother in the arts of war and lordship. And now came Elizabeth, the second surviving daughter, born into this world of war and politics, of royal blood and ambitious claims, of magnificent castles and brutal battlefields. The chamber where she entered the world would have been prepared carefully by the women of the household, following practices that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Cecily would have been attended by midwives and female servants, for childbirth was women's business, from which men were firmly excluded. The chamber would have been warmed by braziers, with the windows covered to keep out draughts and evil spirits that might harm mother or child. Cecily, having already borne 4 children, would have known what to expect, though that knowledge could not eliminate the very real dangers that every woman faced when bringing new life into the world. In an age when medical knowledge remained limited and infection was poorly understood, even wealthy women attended by the best midwives available faced a significant risk of death in childbed. Fever, hemorrhage, or obstructed labour could carry off duchess and peasant alike. That Cecily survived the births of 12 children over the course of her life speaks to her remarkable constitution and perhaps to the quality of care she received. The baby Elizabeth would have been examined carefully by the midwives, who checked for any deformities or signs of ill health. Finding her sound, they would have washed her, wrapped her in swaddling clothes, long strips of linen bound around the infant's body to keep the limbs straight and encourage proper growth, according to medical theory of the time, and presented her to her father. Richard, Duke of York, accepting this second daughter into his family, would have arranged for her baptism in the great cathedral of Rouen, perhaps in the same font where William the Conqueror had received the sacrament centuries before. The baptism ceremony would have been conducted with appropriate solemnity and celebration, for even though Elizabeth was merely a daughter in an age that prized sons for their ability to inherit titles and fight in battles, she was still a child of the House of York, granddaughter of kings, and a potential marriage pawn who could one day cement valuable political alliances. Her godparents were chosen with care, for these individuals assumed spiritual responsibility for the child and often provided material support and political patronage throughout their godchild's life. According to records that survive, Elizabeth's godparents included Jacquetta, Duchess of Bedford, and John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury. Jacquetta was a fascinating figure. Daughter of the Count of St. Paul, she had first married John, Duke of Bedford, the younger brother of King Henry V and Regent of France. After Bedford's death, Jacquetta had secretly married a handsome knight named Richard Woodville, far beneath her in social rank, causing scandal, but creating a love match that would have significant consequences for England's future. Jacquetta's daughter by Woodville was named Elizabeth, the same name chosen for the baby being baptized, and this younger Elizabeth Woodville would one day marry Elizabeth of York's brother Edward and become Queen of England. The Earl of Shrewsbury, the other godparent, was one of England's most celebrated military commanders, a hero of the wars in France. His daughter, Eleanor Talbot, would also intersect with the family's story in dramatic fashion years later. The connections formed at baptism thus linked baby Elizabeth to networks of power and influence that would shape her life in ways impossible to predict on that autumn day in Rouen. Elizabeth's early months unfolded in the castle at Rouen, where her father struggled to maintain English control of Normandy against increasingly effective French resistance. But by the time she was a year old, the situation had deteriorated to the point where Richard's position became untenable. The Earl of Warwick was appointed to replace him, and in November of 1445, the family packed their belongings and sailed across the Channel, leaving France behind forever. The journey to England would have been accomplished aboard one of the great ships that plied the waters between France and England, carrying troops, supplies, and high-ranking passengers. The crossing could take anywhere from several hours to several days, depending on winds and weather. For young Elizabeth, barely more than a year old, the voyage would have left no memory, but it marked her transition from the land of her birth to the island kingdom where she would spend the rest of her life. The family's principal seat in England was Fotheringhay Castle, located in Northamptonshire in the heart of England. This formidable fortress stood on a rise above the River Nene, its towers and walls commanding the flat surrounding countryside. Fotheringhay had been granted to Edmund of Langley when King Richard II created him Duke of York in 1385, and it had remained the chief residence of the House of York ever since. The castle featured a massive keep, strong defensive walls, a great hall for feasting and conducting business, private chambers for the family, a chapel for daily worship, kitchens, storage rooms, stables, and all the other facilities required for a great lord's household. Here, surrounded by her growing family, Elizabeth would spend much of her childhood. The routine of life at Fotheringhay followed patterns that had been established over centuries of feudal society. The day began early, with the household roused by the ringing of the chapel bell, calling everyone to morning prayers. Elizabeth, as she grew old enough to participate, would have joined her family in the chapel, kneeling on the cold stone floor, while a priest celebrated Mass, the ancient Latin phrases echoing in the dim, candle-lit space. After prayers came the morning meal, bread and ale for most of the household, perhaps some cold meat or cheese for those of higher rank. The dining arrangements in a medieval castle reflected the strict social hierarchy. The Duke and Duchess dined at the high table on a raised platform at one end of the great hall, while lesser members of the household and servants occupied tables arranged down the length of the room. Elizabeth, as a daughter of the house, would have taken her place at the high table once she was old enough to eat with the adults, learning to conduct herself with the dignity and decorum expected of a great lady. The hours after breakfast were devoted to lessons and activities appropriate to each person's station. For Elizabeth and her sister Anne, this meant education in the skills expected of noble women. A tutor, likely a clergyman skilled in letters, would have instructed them in reading and writing. Literacy was not universal among the nobility. Many great lords could barely sign their names. But for women of the highest rank, the ability to read was increasingly common and valued. Elizabeth would have learned to read English, the vernacular language, and also French, which remained the language of the aristocracy and the law courts, a legacy of the Norman conquest 4 centuries earlier. Religious instruction formed a crucial part of a young noblewoman's education. Elizabeth would have memorized prayers in Latin, even if she did not fully understand the language. She learned the stories of the Bible, the lives of the saints, and the complex calendar of holy days and feast days that structured the medieval year. The Church taught that women were particularly prone to sin, following Eve's role in mankind's fall from grace, and that they needed constant guidance and supervision to keep them on the path of righteousness. Young girls were therefore taught humility, obedience, and piety above all other virtues. Beyond religious training, Elizabeth received instruction in the domestic arts. Needlework occupied many hours of her youth. Medieval noblewomen were expected to produce exquisite embroidery, creating elaborately decorated altar cloths for churches, cushions and hangings for their homes, and garments adorned with intricate patterns. The finest work used silk threads in many colors, sometimes incorporating gold or silver thread for special richness. Elizabeth would have learned dozens of different stitches, practiced on small pieces of linen or canvas until her technique was flawless, and then progressed to more ambitious projects. Music formed another essential part of her education. Song was everywhere in medieval life, in the churches during services, in the great halls during evening entertainment, in the gardens and chambers where ladies gathered to pass the time. Elizabeth would have learned to sing, training her voice to carry a melody sweetly and to harmonize with others. She may have learned to play an instrument as well, perhaps the lute with its pear-shaped body and delicate strings, or the small portable organ called a portative, which could be carried from place to place and played by one person. Dancing required careful instruction, for the formal dances performed at court and during great celebrations demanded precision and grace. Each dance followed specific patterns with prescribed steps, hand gestures, and bows or curtsies at particular moments. To perform incorrectly was to display ignorance and poor breeding. Elizabeth would have practiced these dances with her siblings and other children of the household, learning to move with the flowing dignity expected of someone of her rank. The rhythm of the year was marked by religious festivals and seasonal changes. Christmas brought 12 days of feasting, gift-giving, and entertainment. The castle would be decorated with greenery, holly, ivy, and mistletoe brought in from the forests. The great hall would echo with music and laughter as the household celebrated the birth of Christ and the turning of the year. Epiphany, on January 6th, marked the end of the Christmas season with a final round of festivities. Easter, the most important feast in the Christian calendar, required elaborate preparations. The weeks of Lent leading up to Easter were a time of fasting and penitence, when meat was forbidden and the household subsisted on fish, vegetables, and bread. The great fast ended with the joy of Easter Sunday, when the chapel bells rang out and the household feasted on lamb, fresh butter, eggs, and all the foods that had been forbidden during Lent. Summer brought its own rhythms. The castle gardens bloomed with flowers and herbs. Musicians and entertainers might visit, bringing news from other parts of England and performing for the household. If the Duke travelled to attend Parliament in London or to visit his other estates, some members of the family might accompany him, while others remained at Fotheringhay to maintain the household. Autumn meant harvest time, when the Duke's tenant farmers brought in the crops that would feed the castle through the winter. The great barns filled with grain. Vegetables were stored in root cellars. Livestock was slaughtered and the meat salted or smoked for preservation. The approaching winter required intensive preparation. For once, the cold weather set in and roads became impassable with mud and snow. Each manor and castle had to be largely self-sufficient. Into this world of rhythms and rituals, Elizabeth grew from infant to child to young girl. She watched her family continue to expand. Margaret was born in May of 1446, another sister who would prove to have a remarkable destiny. Several children who followed did not survive infancy. Medieval childhood was dangerous, and even the children of the highest nobility faced risks from disease, accidents, and mysterious ailments that could carry off a healthy baby in a matter of days. George came into the world in 1449, another sturdy boy. And finally, in October of 1452, Cecily delivered her last son, Richard, at Fotheringhay Castle. This youngest brother was born with reportedly one shoulder higher than the other. Though accounts differ, and much of what was later written about Richard's appearance was probably Tudor propaganda designed to make him appear physically deformed, as evidence of his supposedly twisted soul. By the time Richard was born, Elizabeth was 8 years old enough to help care for the baby, to watch her mother's servants wrap him in swaddling, to hear him cry in the night. She would have been aware, even at that young age, that the political situation surrounding her family was growing increasingly dangerous. Her father returned from France with grievances and ambitions. He believed that England was being poorly governed by incompetent favourites surrounding the weak King Henry VI. He particularly blamed Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, for the disasters in France, and he made no secret of his views. The autumn of 1452 brought news from London that would change everything. King Henry VI, always mentally fragile, had suffered a complete breakdown. In August, he had fallen into a state of catatonic stupor, unable to speak, to recognize anyone around him, or to respond to any stimulus. He simply sat, staring at nothing, for months on end. A great council of nobles tried to govern in the king's name, but the absence of royal authority created a dangerous power vacuum. Elizabeth's father saw his opportunity. In March of 1454, Parliament appointed Richard, Duke of York, as protector of the realm, effectively making him regent during the king's incapacity. With this new authority, York arrested his enemy Somerset and imprisoned him in the Tower of London. For more than a year, Richard governed England, demonstrating the capability and energy that he believed should have been employed long before. But in January of 1455, King Henry suddenly recovered his wits. He emerged from his catatonic state as mysteriously as he had entered it, able to speak and think once more. His first acts were to reverse everything York had done. Somerset was released and restored to favour. York was dismissed as protector. The Duke of York's brief moment of power was over, and he faced the very real possibility that Somerset would take revenge. Tensions escalated rapidly. By May of 1455, both sides were raising armies. On May 22nd, they clashed in the streets of St Albans, a market town north of London. The battle was short and decisive. The Duke of York and his ally Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, led their forces in an attack that overwhelmed Somerset's unprepared troops. Somerset himself was killed, cut down in front of an inn, along with several other Lancastrian lords. King Henry was wounded by an arrow but survived, falling into Yorkist hands. This first battle of St Albans marked the beginning of what would eventually be called the Wars of the Roses, though that name was an invention of later times. The white rose was associated with York and the red rose with Lancaster, but these symbols were more symbolic than real. Most soldiers in the wars fought under the personal banners of their lords, not under rose badges. Nevertheless, the battle inaugurated 3 decades of intermittent civil war that would devastate England's nobility and eventually lead to the extinction of the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England since 1154. For Elizabeth, now 11 years old, the battle meant that her father had openly defied the king and shed royal blood in the streets of an English town. Though York and Warwick claimed they were acting to rescue the king from evil counsellors rather than rebelling against royal authority, everyone understood that the situation had crossed a line. The House of York was now indelibly associated with violence against the Lancastrian crown. After St Albans, there followed several years of uneasy peace, with York and the Nevilles dominating the government, while King Henry, weak and manipulated, remained the figurehead on the throne. But Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry's formidable French wife, was working tirelessly to build a power base and destroy York. She gathered allies among the nobility who resented Yorkist influence, and she ensured that her son Edward, Prince of Wales, born in October 1453, was recognised as heir to the throne. Margaret would fight with ferocious determination to preserve that inheritance for her child. By 1459, when Elizabeth was 15, the situation exploded into open warfare again. York, the Earl of Salisbury, and Salisbury's son, Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, for his role in making and unmaking kings, raised their forces and marched to confront the Queen's army. But at Ludford Bridge, near Ludlow Castle, York's army fell apart when troops from the Calais garrison, who were supposed to form the core of his strength, refused to fight against the king's banner. York fled to Ireland. The Nevilles escaped to Calais. Elizabeth's mother Cecily, left behind at Ludlow Castle with the younger children George and Richard, was captured and brought before a hostile parliament at Coventry. There, in an act of theatre designed to humiliate the House of York, Parliament declared Richard, Duke of York, a traitor, stripped him of all his titles and lands, and left his wife and children to subsist on a small allowance. Cecily bore this reversal with dignity, but it must have been terrifying for the children, who saw their mother treated as the wife of an attainted traitor, their wealth and position seemingly gone forever. Yet fortune's wheel turned again with dizzying speed. In June of 1460, Warwick and Salisbury landed in England with an army and marched on London. The city, always sympathetic to York, opened its gates. They advanced north and met the royal army at Northampton on July 10th. Through treachery in the king's forces, the battle was won quickly and decisively. King Henry was captured, and Warwick brought him back to London. Queen Margaret and Prince Edward fled to Scotland. York remained in Ireland through the summer, but in September he finally returned. He marched to London with great ceremony, flying banners bearing the royal arms of England. When he reached Westminster, he entered Parliament, strode to the throne, and placed his hand upon it, clearly indicating that he intended to claim the crown for himself. But even his own supporters were not prepared for this. Deposing a crowned and anointed king was a step too far. After days of uncomfortable debate, a compromise was reached. The Act of Accord of October 1460 declared that Henry would remain king for his lifetime, but upon his death, the crown would pass to Richard, Duke of York, and his heirs, disinheriting Queen Margaret's son. This solution satisfied no one. Queen Margaret would never accept her son's disinheritance. She gathered a great army in the north and prepared to fight. York, with a small force, marched north to confront her, spending Christmas at Sandal Castle near Wakefield. On December 30th, 1460, the Lancastrians attacked. The Battle of Wakefield was a disaster for York. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, his army was destroyed. Richard, Duke of York himself, was killed in the fighting. Accounts differ on exactly how, but he died on the battlefield at age 49. Elizabeth's brother Edmund, Earl of Rutland, fled the field, but was pursued by Lord Clifford, a Lancastrian commander whose father had died at St. Albans. Clifford caught the 17-year-old youth and killed him, either in hot blood during pursuit or in cold blood after capture. Again, sources differ. What is certain is that Edmund died that day, a boy barely old enough to grow a proper beard, cut down in the savage violence of civil war. The heads of Richard, Duke of York, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, the Earl of Salisbury, and other Yorkist leaders were cut off and placed on spikes above Micklegate Bar in York City. A paper crown was placed on the Duke's head, mocking his ambition to wear the real crown of England. There the heads remained for weeks, weather-beaten and pecked by crows, a grim warning to anyone who would challenge the House of Lancaster. News of the disaster reached Elizabeth at Fotheringhay. Her father was dead. Her brother was dead. Everything seemed lost. She was 16 years old, unmarried, part of a family now stained with attainder and defeat. Her mother Cecily gathered the remaining family members and moved to London, to Baynard's Castle, the family's townhouse on the Thames. There they waited to see what would happen next. What happened was that Elizabeth's eldest brother Edward, now Duke of York at age 18, took command of the Yorkist cause. Tall, handsome, charismatic, and a brilliant military commander, Edward rallied his father's forces. In February of 1461, he won a victory at Mortimer's Cross in Wales. Then he marched toward London. Meanwhile, Warwick had been defeated at a second battle of St. Albans, and Queen Margaret's army was advancing on the capital. But London, fearing the undisciplined northern soldiers, closed its gates against her. When Edward arrived, the city welcomed him. On March 4th, 1461, in a ceremony at Baynard's Castle, witnessed by Elizabeth and the rest of the family, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV. The 18-year-old Duke had become a king, but he had to win his crown on the battlefield. That battlefield was Towton, in Yorkshire, where on Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1461, the two armies met in a snowstorm. What followed was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Contemporary estimates suggest that over 50,000 men were engaged, and casualties may have exceeded 20,000. The fighting went on for hours in blinding snow, men slipping on blood-soaked ground, the screams of the wounded and dying mixing with the clash of steel on steel and the thunder of horses' hooves. When the Yorkists finally broke the Lancastrian line late in the afternoon, the defeated army fled. Many drowned trying to cross the swollen River Cock, which was said to have run red with blood for days. The slaughter continued for miles as Yorkist cavalry pursued and killed fleeing enemies. It was a massacre, a day of horror that traumatized survivors and became legend. But it was also a decisive victory. King Henry, Queen Margaret, and Prince Edward fled to Scotland. The Lancastrian cause was broken. Edward marched south and was crowned King Edward IV on June 28, 1461, in Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth's brother was now anointed King of England, consecrated with holy oil, crowned with the sacred crown of St. Edward, holding the orb and scepter that symbolized royal authority. For Elizabeth and her family, everything had changed. They were no longer a duke's family under attainder. They were the king's family. Elizabeth was now the king's sister, a position of immense prestige and potential influence. Her mother Cecily became mother of the king, a position that came with honor, wealth, and political importance. Elizabeth's younger brothers George and Richard, who had hidden in Burgundy during the final crisis, returned to England as royal princes. And for Elizabeth herself, now 17 years old and unmarried, her elevated status meant that her marriage would be a matter of high politics, an alliance that could strengthen her brother's new regime. The negotiations for her future would begin soon, and they would result in a match that would shape the rest of her long life. In the year 1457, when Elizabeth had reached the age of 12 or 13, discussions began regarding her marriage. In the world of 15th century English nobility, a girl's marriage was rarely a matter of personal choice or romantic inclination. Instead, it represented a carefully calculated political alliance, a merger of families, properties, and interests that could strengthen a dynasty's position for generations to come. For a girl of Elizabeth's exalted birth, daughter of a duke who claimed royal blood and who aspired to the throne itself, the selection of a husband carried particular weight and significance. The young man chosen for Elizabeth's hand was John de la Pole, the son and heir of the late William de la Pole, 1st Duke of Suffolk. John had been born on September 27th, 1442, making him approximately 2 years Elizabeth's senior. A modest age difference by the standards of an age when noble girls were often betrothed to men decades older than themselves. To understand Elizabeth's marriage, we must first understand the complicated and tragic history of the de la Pole family, for their story was intimately intertwined with the tumultuous politics of mid-15th century England. The de la Pole family had risen from merchant origins in the northern city of Kingston upon Hull, where they had made their fortune in the wool trade that formed the foundation of England's medieval economy. The family's founder, William de la Pole the merchant, had used his wealth to purchase lands and to loan money to the crown, gradually buying his way into the lower ranks of the nobility. His son, Michael de la Pole, had served King Edward III and then Richard II, rising to become Earl of Suffolk and Lord Chancellor, before falling victim to the political intrigues of Richard II's troubled reign. Accused of treason and corruption, he had been forced to flee to France, where he died in exile. Michael's sons had worked to rebuild the family's position. The second son, also named Michael, had died fighting for King Henry V at the Siege of Harfleur in 1415. The third son, William, had distinguished himself as a military commander in the French wars, rising through the ranks to become one of Henry VI's most trusted advisors, and eventually being elevated to the Dukedom of Suffolk in 1448. William had married Alice Chaucer, the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, the famous poet, whose Canterbury Tales had helped establish English as a literary language. Alice brought substantial wealth and property to the marriage, including the beautiful manor of Ewelme in Oxfordshire, with its stunning late medieval church and almshouse that still stand today as masterpieces of Perpendicular Gothic architecture. For a decade in the 1440s, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, had been the most powerful man in England after the king. He dominated the government while King Henry VI, gentle and pious, but utterly lacking in political acumen, spent his time founding colleges and practicing religious devotions. Suffolk arranged the king's marriage to Margaret of Anjou, a French princess, in a bid to make peace with France. But the marriage treaty required England to surrender the valuable territory of Maine. And when this became known, public opinion turned sharply against Suffolk. The situation deteriorated further when English forces in France suffered a series of catastrophic defeats. Normandy, which England had held for decades, was lost. Rouen, where Elizabeth would be born just a few years later, fell to French forces in October of 1449. The English possessions that Henry V had won at such cost were melting away, and the English public blamed Suffolk for the disasters. He was accused of corruption, treason, and even plotting to seize the throne for himself. Popular ballads circulated calling for his death. In January of 1450, Parliament moved to impeach Suffolk on charges that included embezzling crown funds, mismanaging the war, and conspiring with the French. King Henry, desperate to protect his favourite minister, decided to exile Suffolk for 5 years, rather than allow Parliament to try and execute him. On May 1st, 1450, William de la Pole boarded a ship called the Nicholas of the Tower, bound for France and exile. But Suffolk never reached the continent. In the waters off Dover, his ship was intercepted by another vessel called the Nicholas of the Tower, confusingly the same name. Armed men boarded Suffolk's ship and seized him. He was transferred to a small boat, where his captors held a mock trial. Finding him guilty of betraying England, they condemned him to death. But there was no executioner and no proper axe. Instead, they used a rusty sword, and it took 6 clumsy, agonizing strokes to hack through his neck. His body was thrown onto the beach at Dover, where it lay for days before anyone dared claim it. This brutal murder left young John de la Pole fatherless at the age of 7. The boy had inherited his father's titles and estates in theory, but the taint of treason and the hostility of public opinion made his position precarious. His mother, Alice Chaucer, a strong and capable woman, took charge of managing the family's affairs and protecting her son's interests during his minority. As a small child, John had been married to Margaret Beaufort, the daughter and heiress of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. This marriage, arranged when both children were barely old enough to walk, was typical of the dynastic marriages among the highest nobility. Great families secured valuable alliances by betrothing their children in infancy, sometimes even in the cradle. But Margaret's father died in 1444, and her wardship and the right to arrange her next marriage fell to William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, who happened to be managing her affairs at the time. After Suffolk's death, the king granted Margaret's wardship to Edmund Tudor, and the marriage between little John de la Pole and little Margaret Beaufort was annulled in February of 1453. Margaret went on to marry Edmund Tudor and would eventually give birth to a son named Henry, who would seize the throne as Henry VII. Now, in 1457, Alice Chaucer was seeking a new and more advantageous match for her 15-year-old son. John had not yet inherited his titles. The Dukedom of Suffolk remained forfeited due to his father's attainder, though the family retained considerable wealth in lands and property. Alice appears to have been the driving force behind the negotiations for John's marriage to Elizabeth of York. For the de la Pole family, such a match offered rehabilitation and renewed status. Marrying the daughter of Richard, Duke of York, the most powerful magnate in the realm and a potential claimant to the throne, would announce to the world that the de la Poles had overcome the disgrace of William's execution and had returned to the highest circles of English nobility. For Richard, Duke of York, the alliance with the de la Poles offered certain advantages despite the family's recent troubles. The de la Poles held extensive estates in East Anglia, particularly in Suffolk and Norfolk, regions of significant economic importance. They maintained connections to both Yorkist and Lancastrian circles, which could be useful in the fluid politics of the time. Moreover, Alice Chaucer controlled substantial wealth through her own inheritance and her dower rights from her late husband, making her one of the richest women in England. An alliance with such a family, even one recently disgraced, had practical benefits. The betrothal was arranged sometime in late 1457 or early 1458, when Elizabeth was 12 or 13 years old, the minimum age at which canon law permitted a girl to consent to marriage. The wedding itself took place before February of 1458, as documents from that date refer to John de la Pole as Elizabeth's husband. The ceremony would have been conducted according to the rites of the Catholic Church, the only form of Christianity practiced in England before the Reformation. A priest would have officiated, probably in the chapel of one of the family's great houses, perhaps at Fotheringhay, or at one of the de la Pole estates. The marriage ceremony followed forms that had been standardized throughout Western Christendom. The couple stood before the priest at the church door. Medieval weddings began outside the church building itself, moving inside only for the nuptial mass that followed the vows. John would have taken Elizabeth's right hand in his and repeated after the priest the words of the marriage vow, "I, John, take thee, Elizabeth, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, till death us do part, and thereto I plight thee my troth." Elizabeth, in turn, would have made her vow, "I, Elizabeth, take thee, John, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, till death us do part, and thereto I plight thee my troth." The word bonny meant obedient, while buxom in medieval usage meant compliant and gracious, not the physical description it later became. The vows thus emphasized the wife's duty of obedience to her husband, reflecting the patriarchal structure of medieval society. After the exchange of vows, John would have placed a ring on Elizabeth's finger, and the priest would have blessed the marriage, sprinkling the couple with holy water. Then the wedding party would have processed into the church for Mass, during which special prayers for the couple's fertility and prosperity would be offered. A feast would have followed, with all the elaborate ceremonial appropriate to a union between two great families. Tables would have been set up in the great hall, decorated with fresh rushes on the floor and tapestries hung on the walls. Servants would have brought course after course of food, roasted meats, pies, fish, vegetables, fruits, sweetmeats, and wine in great quantities. Musicians would have played while the guests feasted. There might have been entertainers, jugglers, acrobats, or minstrels singing songs. the celebration could have lasted for days, as great nobles from across England gathered to witness and celebrate the marriage. But beyond the ceremony and the feasting lay the reality of married life for a 13-year-old girl and a 15-year-old boy. They were children by our standards, though medieval society considered them old enough to take on adult responsibilities. Elizabeth would have been educated in what was expected of her as a wife, obedience to her husband, management of his household, bearing of his children. John would have been taught his duties as a husband and lord, protection and support of his wife, proper management of his estates, fulfillment of his obligations to the king and to his feudal inferiors. The young couple took up residence primarily at Wingfield Castle in Suffolk, one of the principal seats of the de la Pole family. Wingfield stood in the heart of East Anglia, that flat, fertile region of eastern England that had grown wealthy from the wool trade and from agriculture. The castle had come into the de la Pole family through inheritance from the Wingfield family. Michael de la Pole, the first Earl of Suffolk, had married Catherine Wingfield, daughter and heiress of Sir John Wingfield, bringing Wingfield Castle as part of her inheritance. The castle itself was a substantial medieval fortress built in the 14th century and designed to serve both military and residential functions. High stone walls surrounded a courtyard. Towers rose at the corners, providing defensive positions and also luxurious private chambers for the family. A gatehouse controlled access, with a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands and a portcullis that could be dropped to seal the entrance in times of danger. The great hall stood as the centre of communal life, a vast space with a high roof supported by timber beams, where the household gathered for meals and where the lord conducted business and dispensed justice. Private chambers on the upper floors provided living space for the family. These rooms would have had fireplaces for warmth and luxury, as most people had to make do with central hearths that filled rooms with smoke. The walls might be hung with tapestries or painted cloths to keep out draughts and to provide decoration. Windows, though small by modern standards, were glazed with expensive glass, another mark of wealth and status. Furniture would have included beds with heavy curtains that could be closed for warmth and privacy, chests for storing clothing and valuables, tables, chairs and stools. The castle chapel was a sacred space where the family heard daily mass and marked the great festivals of the Christian year. The kitchen stood separate from the main residential buildings to reduce fire risk, with huge fireplaces and ovens capable of roasting whole oxen and producing the vast quantities of food needed to feed a large household. Storage rooms held barrels of wine and ale, wheels of cheese, smoked and salted meat, sacks of grain, dried fruits, and all the other provisions needed to sustain the household through the winter months, when fresh food was scarce. Surrounding the castle lay the village of Wingfield, whose inhabitants worked the agricultural lands that provided the economic foundation for the de la Pole family's wealth. Beyond the village stretched the fields, meadows, and woodlands of Suffolk, a gently rolling landscape of great beauty and productivity, though the modern observer would have been struck by how much forest remained. England in the 15th century was still a heavily wooded country, with vast expanses of forest that provided timber, fuel, and hunting grounds. Life at Wingfield Castle for the newlywed. Elizabeth followed patterns that had been established over generations. She rose early each morning, for medieval households woke with the sun, and went to bed soon after dark. Candles and rushlights provided illumination after sunset, but they were expensive, and even wealthy households used them sparingly. The day began with prayers in the chapel, then breakfast, a light meal of bread and ale, perhaps some cold meat or cheese. The morning hours were devoted to the countless tasks involved in managing a great household. Elizabeth, as Lady of the Castle, was responsible for overseeing the work of numerous servants. There were cooks and scullery maids in the kitchen, laundresses who washed the household's linens, chambermaids who cleaned the living spaces, serving men who waited at table, grooms who cared for the horses, and many others. Each had their specific duties, and Elizabeth had to ensure that all this work was properly coordinated. She met regularly with the castle's steward, the senior official who managed the day-to-day administration of the household. Together, they reviewed accounts, discussed supplies that needed to be purchased, resolved disputes among the servants, and dealt with the endless practical matters that arose in running an establishment that might house 100 people or more. Elizabeth learned to keep her own accounts, noting expenses and income in careful detail. A noblewoman who could not manage her household efficiently risked both financial difficulties and loss of respect among her peers. Much of Elizabeth's time was spent in needlework, an activity considered both productive and appropriate for women of her station. She worked on embroidering altar cloths for the chapel, creating elaborate designs of biblical scenes or saints using silk thread in many colors. She made or decorated clothing for herself, her husband, and eventually for her children. She produced hangings and cushions to beautify the castle's rooms. This work was not merely decorative. Fine embroidery was a valuable commodity, and the hours spent creating it were seen as both virtuous labor and a meditation on holy themes. Elizabeth also had to oversee the still room, where medicines, preserves, and cosmetics were prepared. A lady of the castle was expected to have knowledge of herbs and their medicinal properties, to be able to care for sick members of the household, to prepare healing salves and tonics. Recipe books passed from mother to daughter contain not only directions for cooking, but also formulas for remedies for common ailments. Elizabeth would have learned to identify healing plants, to prepare rosewater and other fragrant waters, to make salves from beeswax and herbs, and to create the simple medicines that were all that 15th century medical knowledge could offer. The castle gardens provided both pleasure and utility. Vegetable gardens supplied fresh produce during the growing season. Herb gardens grew the medicinal and culinary plants essential to medieval household management. Pleasure gardens, enclosed by walls or hedges, offered space for walking and contemplation, with flowers chosen for their beauty and fragrance, roses, lilies, violets, and many others. Religious observance structured each day and marked the passage of the year. Elizabeth attended Mass daily in the castle chapel, kneeling on the cold stone floor while a priest celebrated the sacred mysteries of the Catholic faith. She observed the fasts required by the Church, no meat on Fridays or during Lent, fasting before receiving communion, abstaining from marital relations on holy days. She marked the great festivals, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the feast days of important saints, with special prayers and appropriate celebrations. As a married woman, Elizabeth was expected to produce children, and specifically sons, who could inherit their father's titles and lands. In an age of high infant and child mortality, when disease could carry off healthy babies in a matter of days, and when childbirth itself posed mortal danger to every woman, producing heirs was a duty that consumed much of a noblewoman's adult life. The Church taught that the primary purpose of marriage was procreation, and that sexual relations within marriage were holy insofar as they were directed toward producing children. Elizabeth's first pregnancy likely came within the first year or two of her marriage. Medieval medical understanding of pregnancy and childbirth was limited and often incorrect, based on the writings of ancient authorities like Aristotle and Galen, rather than on systematic observation. Women relied on midwives, experienced older women who had delivered many babies and who possessed practical knowledge passed down through generations, even if the theoretical understanding was flawed. When Elizabeth's time came to deliver her first child, probably in 1462 when she was 17 or 18 years old, preparations would have been made according to long-established customs. The birthing chamber was made ready, with the windows covered to keep out drafts and light. Medieval medical theory held that women in labor needed to be kept in dim, warm surroundings. The bed was prepared with special linens. A fire blazed in the fireplace to keep the room warm. Midwives were summoned, along with female relatives and servants who would attend the laboring woman. Men were strictly excluded from the birthing chamber. Childbirth was women's business, a mysterious and dangerous process from which males were barred. John de la Pole would have waited elsewhere in the castle, probably in the Great Hall or his private chamber, while his wife laboured to bring their child into the world. He might have paced nervously, or prayed in the chapel, or tried to distract himself with business, but he could do nothing to help and nothing to influence the outcome. The birth was in God's hands, and in the hands of the midwives. Labour could last hours or even days. Medieval midwives had various techniques for easing the process, having the woman walk around, giving her herbal drinks to strengthen contractions, massaging her belly. If labour was prolonged or difficult, they might resort to more dramatic measures, like fumigating the room with herbs or having the woman inhale certain vapours. Prayer was considered essential. The labouring woman would call on the Virgin Mary and on St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, begging for their intercession and protection. When the baby finally emerged, the midwife would cut the umbilical cord, tie it off, and then examine the infant carefully. Was it breathing properly? Were all its limbs formed correctly? Were there any signs of illness or deformity? If all seemed well, the baby would be washed, rubbed with salt, believed to strengthen the skin, and then wrapped tightly in swaddling clothes. Long strips of linen wound around the body to keep the limbs straight and to prevent the baby from harming itself with its own movements. Elizabeth's first child was a son, named John after his father. This was cause for great celebration, for a male heir was what every noble family hoped for. The baby was baptized soon after birth. The church taught that unbaptized infants who died could not enter heaven, so baptism was urgent. The ceremony would have taken place in the castle chapel, with the priest performing the rite while godparents held the baby and spoke the vows on its behalf. A son born to noble parents in the 15th century faced numerous dangers before reaching adulthood. Disease was the greatest threat. Plague, smallpox, measles, dysentery, and countless other ailments could kill a child quickly. Poor sanitation and lack of understanding about how diseases spread meant that epidemics could tear through households with devastating effect. Accidents claimed many young lives: falls, drownings, burns, injuries from animals or from play. Even minor cuts could become infected and fatal. But young John de la Pole, eldest son of Elizabeth of York and her husband, survived these dangers. He grew from infant to toddler to child, receiving the education appropriate to a boy of his station. He learned to ride horses, essential for any nobleman. He practiced with wooden swords, preparing for the day when he would train with real weapons. He learned his letters and numbers, studied Latin, and absorbed the complex code of behavior that governed noble life. While Elizabeth was bearing and raising young John, the political situation in England had been convulsing through the dramatic changes already described. Her father had claimed the throne, been accepted as heir, then been killed at Wakefield. Her brother Edward had been proclaimed king and won his crown at Towton. By 1463, when Elizabeth was 19, her brother, King Edward IV, formally restored John de la Pole to his father's titles, making him the second Duke of Suffolk. Elizabeth thus became a duchess, a title of great prestige that she would hold for the rest of her life. This restoration of the de la Pole family's position reflected Edward's gratitude to those who had supported the Yorkist cause, but also his practical political sense. The de la Poles controlled significant lands and influence in East Anglia, a prosperous and populous region. By treating them generously, Edward secured their loyalty and strengthened his position. He granted the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk various offices and lands, providing them with income and status. Elizabeth and John attended court for major ceremonies and celebrations. In May of 1465, Elizabeth walked in the coronation procession for Elizabeth Woodville, King Edward's controversial new queen. The king had stunned everyone by secretly marrying Elizabeth Woodville in May of 1464. She was a widow of a Lancastrian knight, beautiful, but without the royal blood or foreign political connections that everyone had expected Edward's queen to possess. Worse, she brought a large family of siblings who now expected positions and marriages appropriate to their new status as the king's in-laws. At the coronation, Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk, walked immediately behind Queen Elizabeth Woodville in the procession, apart from the Duchess of Buckingham, who was carrying the Queen's train. This position of honour reflected Elizabeth's status as the King's sister. She witnessed the elaborate ceremonies as the new Queen was crowned in Westminster Abbey, the golden crown placed upon her head, while bells rang and the congregation sang hymns of praise. The day was followed by a great feast where hundreds of nobles and distinguished guests dined on dozens of elaborate dishes served on gold and silver plate. Elizabeth returned to Wingfield after these ceremonial appearances, back to the quieter rhythms of life in Suffolk. Her second son, Geoffrey, was born around 1464. Unlike his older brother John, who would be groomed to inherit the dukedom and the family's lands, Geoffrey was destined for the church, following a common practice among noble families who needed to provide for younger sons without dividing the inheritance among multiple heirs. In 1466, Elizabeth was delivered of her third son, Edward. This birth took place at Ewelme, the beautiful Oxfordshire manor that belonged to Elizabeth's mother-in-law, Alice Chaucer. Alice made elaborate preparations for her daughter-in-law's lying in, ensuring that Elizabeth would be delivered in comfort and splendour. Records survive describing the care taken to prepare the chamber, the quality of the linens, the arrangements for the midwives and attendants. Alice's attentiveness reflects both affection for Elizabeth and the importance placed on safely delivering noble children. The births continued in steady succession through the late 1460s and into the 1470s. Around 1468, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, also named Elizabeth, following the common practice of naming children after parents or grandparents. This little Elizabeth would marry Henry Lovell, 8th Baron Morley, though the marriage would produce no children, and the young woman would die in 1489 at about 21 years old. In 1471 came Edmund, another son, whose name honoured Elizabeth's brother Edmund, Earl of Rutland, who had been killed at Wakefield. Dorothy followed in 1472, though this daughter would die young, one of the few of Elizabeth's children who did not survive to adulthood. Humphrey was born in 1474, and like his brother Geoffrey, he would enter the church rather than pursuing a secular career. Anne came into the world in 1476. She would eventually become the 7th prioress of Sion Abbey, one of the most prestigious religious houses in England. Catherine followed around 1477, and she would marry William Staunton, the 5th Baron Staunton, though this marriage too would remain childless. William was born in 1478, and finally Richard, the youngest, arrived in 1480, when Elizabeth was 36 years old. 11 children born over 18 years. This was extraordinary even by the standards of an age when large families were the norm among those who could afford to feed and clothe them. Elizabeth's body endured 11 pregnancies, 11 labours, 11 deliveries, each time risking death or permanent injury. That she survived all these births in an age when medical knowledge was limited and when even minor complications could prove fatal speaks to her robust constitution, to the quality of care she received, and to sheer good fortune. The fact that 10 of her 11 children survived to adulthood was equally remarkable. In 15th century England, mortality among infants and young children was staggeringly high. Roughly half of all babies died before their 5th birthday, victims of disease, accident, malnutrition, or the countless hazards of medieval life. That Elizabeth lost only Dorothy in childhood was extraordinarily fortunate, and she must have offered many prayers of thanksgiving for God's mercy in preserving her children. Raising this large brood of children occupied much of Elizabeth's time and energy through her 20s and 30s. The castle at Wingfield would have echoed with children's voices, crying infants, toddlers learning to walk and talk, older children running through the halls at play. The girls would have been educated in the skills appropriate to noble women, much as Elizabeth herself had been trained. The boys received instruction in letters, numbers, Latin, horsemanship, hunting, and the arts of war. Tutors were hired to teach them, clergymen to instruct them in religious knowledge, weapons masters to train them in swordplay and other martial skills. As the children grew older, some were sent to live in other noble households, following the common practice of fostering. This system served multiple purposes. It created bonds between families. It exposed young people to different environments and broadened their education. And it removed some of the burden of supporting large numbers of children from any single household. Elizabeth's eldest son John, as heir to the dukedom, spent time at King Edward's court, learning the ways of royal administration and making connections with other young nobles who would one day form the governing class of England. Through these years of childbearing and child-rearing, Elizabeth watched England's political situation evolve. Her brother, King Edward, ruled with energy and competence through the 1460s, but tensions grew between Edward and Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick, called the Kingmaker for his role in placing Edward on the throne, expected to be the power behind the throne, guiding royal policy and enriching himself and his family. But Edward proved to have his own ideas about governance, and he increasingly sidelined Warwick in favour of his wife's Woodville relatives. In 1469, these tensions exploded into open rebellion. Warwick allied with Elizabeth's brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had married Warwick's daughter Isabel in defiance of the king's wishes. They raised an army and briefly captured King Edward himself. But Edward regained his freedom and seemed willing to forgive his brother and former ally. The reconciliation was superficial. In 1470, Warwick and Clarence fled to France, where they formed an alliance with Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen. With French support, they invaded England in September. King Edward, caught off guard, was forced to flee to Burgundy, where his sister Margaret, now Duchess of Burgundy, provided him with refuge and support. The restored Lancastrian government, called the Readeption, freed King Henry VI from the Tower of London and reinstalled him on the throne. For 6 months, it seemed that the Yorkist cause was finished. Elizabeth's husband John, Duke of Suffolk, navigated this dangerous period cautiously, neither openly opposing the Readeption, nor committing himself too firmly to either side. This political trimming would earn him a reputation for caution that would last throughout his life. But in March of 1471, Edward returned to England with an army provided by his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. The Duke of Suffolk supported Edward's return, fighting for the Yorkists at the crucial battles that followed. At Barnet on April 14, Edward's forces defeated Warwick's army in a confusing battle fought in heavy fog. Warwick himself was killed, either in the fighting or shortly after while trying to escape. His death removed the most powerful and ambitious noble in England, changing the political landscape forever. 2 weeks later, at Tewkesbury on May 4th, Edward destroyed the remaining Lancastrian army. Edward of Lancaster, the 17-year-old Prince of Wales and son of King Henry and Queen Margaret, was killed in the battle or its immediate aftermath. His death extinguished the direct Lancastrian line and ended any real hope of a Lancastrian restoration. King Henry VI died in the Tower of London on May 21st, officially of melancholy at his son's death, though few believed this. Most assumed that Henry had been quietly murdered on King Edward's orders, eliminating the last remaining Lancastrian claimant. With both Henry and his son dead, Edward IV was secure on his throne. Elizabeth's husband John received honours for his loyalty during the crisis. In 1472, he was made a Knight of the Garter, the most prestigious order of chivalry in England. This honour, limited to just 24 knights at any time, represented the highest recognition of noble service. The elaborate ceremonies of the order, with their medieval pageantry and religious solemnity, took place at Windsor Castle, and Elizabeth would have attended as her husband was inducted into this exclusive brotherhood. In 1477, Elizabeth herself received a similar honour when she was named a Lady of the Garter, along with her mother Cecily Neville and her sister-in-law Queen Elizabeth Woodville. The order rarely admitted women, making this recognition especially significant. It acknowledged Elizabeth's status as the king's sister and her position among the highest-ranking noblewomen in the realm. Life at Wingfield during these years followed comfortable and established patterns. The castle and its surrounding estates provided a good living for Elizabeth's family. The Duke of Suffolk administered his lands, collected rents from his tenants, served on royal commissions for Suffolk and Norfolk, and fulfilled the various obligations that came with his rank. Elizabeth managed the household, oversaw the raising and education of their children, participated in the religious and social life of the local community, and occasionally travelled to court for major ceremonies. The rhythm of the agricultural year governed life in the countryside. Spring brought ploughing and planting, with the Duke's tenant farmers working the fields that would produce the grain, vegetables, and other crops that fed the region. Summer was a time of growth and maintenance, of tending crops and livestock, of making hay to feed animals through the winter. Autumn meant harvest, that crucial season when the year's labour was gathered in and stored against the coming cold and darkness. Winter was a time of reduced activity, when people huddled indoors, living on stored food and praying that supplies would last until spring brought new growth. Religious festivals marked the year as surely as the seasons. Christmas brought 12 days of feasting and celebration, with special foods, entertainment, gift-giving, and religious observances. The Great Hall would be decorated with evergreen boughs, holly, ivy, laurel, rosemary, and other plants that stayed green through winter, symbolizing eternal life. Boar's head, roasted peacock displayed with its feathers reattached. Elaborate pies, sweetmeats, wine, and ale in abundance filled the tables. Musicians played, jesters entertained, and the household celebrated the birth of Christ and the hope of redemption. Epiphany on January 6th marked the end of the Christmas season with a final round of festivities. Then came the austerity of Lent, 40 days of fasting and penance leading up to Easter. During Lent, meat was forbidden, and the household ate fish, vegetables, bread, and other foods that did not violate the fast. This was not merely symbolic. The Church enforced these rules, and violations could result in serious penalties. Easter, the greatest feast of the Christian year, celebrated Christ's resurrection from the dead. The churches were decorated with flowers and candles, the best vestments were brought out, and the chapel bell rang joyfully, calling the faithful to worship. The household broke their fast with a great feast, and the celebration continued for days. Other festivals dotted the year: Pentecost, celebrating the descent of the Holy Spirit on the apostles; the Feast of Corpus Christi in late spring, when processions carried the consecrated host through the streets in elaborate reliquaries; Michaelmas at the end of September; All Saints' Day in November; and dozens of saints' days when particular holy figures were honoured, and when, depending on the saint's importance, work might cease and feasting might begin. Elizabeth's mother Cecily visited Wingfield often during these years. The Duchess of York, now living primarily at Berkhamsted Castle in Hertfordshire, maintained close relationships with all her surviving children. Records indicate that Cecily was present for the births of at least some of Elizabeth's children, and she provided financial support and guidance throughout Elizabeth's adult life. The bond between mother and daughter seems to have been particularly strong, perhaps strengthened by the many tragedies they had endured together. The deaths of Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund, Earl of Rutland at Wakefield, the political upheavals and reversals of fortune, the constant anxiety of living through civil war. In 1478, another tragedy struck the York family when George, Duke of Clarence, was executed for treason. Clarence had never truly reconciled with King Edward after his betrayals in the late 1460s. He continued to plot and scheme, making wild accusations against the Queen, interfering in legal cases, and generally making himself an intolerable problem for his brother the King. His wife Isabel Neville, Warwick's daughter, had died in 1476, possibly from complications of childbirth, and Clarence's behaviour became increasingly erratic after her death. Finally, in January of 1478, Edward's patience snapped. Clarence was arrested and tried before Parliament on charges of treason. The trial was a formality. Everyone knew the verdict was predetermined. Clarence was convicted and sentenced to death. On February 18, 1478, he was executed privately in the Tower of London. Legend says he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, though the truth of this colourful detail remains uncertain. What is certain is that King Edward had ordered his own brother's death, an act that shocked contemporaries and would haunt Edward for the rest of his life. Elizabeth must have grieved for this brother, despite his many faults. Clarence had been part of her childhood, one of the younger brothers who had been protected and educated alongside her. His execution demonstrated the ruthlessness that political life could demand, even within families. It was a grim reminder that in the world of 15th century politics, treason, even from one's own blood relations, could not be tolerated. Life went on. More children were born. The estates needed management. The duties of a duchess demanded attention regardless of personal grief. Elizabeth continued her work of bearing children. The last, Richard, arriving in 1480 when Elizabeth was 36. This was considered quite old for childbearing by medieval standards. Most women who survived to their mid-30s had finished bearing children by that age, as fertility declined and the risks of pregnancy and childbirth increased with age. But Elizabeth survived this final birth, as she had survived the previous 10. and young Richard joined his numerous siblings at Wingfield. By the spring of 1483, Elizabeth had reached the age of 38, settled into the comfortable routines of middle age, and well established in her position as Duchess of Suffolk and sister to the King of England. Her children ranged from young Richard, just 3 years old, to her eldest son John, now about 21, and serving in important positions under his uncle King Edward. The peaceful years of Edward IV's second reign had allowed Elizabeth's family to prosper quietly at Wingfield, far from the intrigues and dangers of the royal court. But this tranquility was about to be shattered by events that would plunge England into crisis once again and set in motion the chain of circumstances that would eventually destroy Elizabeth's sons. On April 9th, 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly at Westminster Palace. He was only 40 years old, and though he had grown fat and self-indulgent in his later years, enjoying rich food and wine perhaps too freely, his death came with shocking swiftness. He had been feeling unwell for some weeks, suffering from what contemporary accounts describe as a fever or ague. Some historians have speculated that he died of pneumonia. Others suggest a stroke or even poisoning, but the true cause of his death remains uncertain. What is known is that within a matter of days, the robust warrior king, who had won his crown on the battlefield at Towton, was dead, leaving his throne to his 12-year-old son. The young Edward, Prince of Wales, was at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border when news of his father's death reached him. He had been living there under the guardianship of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, receiving the education in governance and military affairs appropriate to an heir to the throne. Now he was summoned to London for his coronation. The date was set for early May, and preparations began for the elaborate ceremonies that would transform the boy into an anointed king. But before young Edward could reach London, events took an unexpected and dramatic turn. Elizabeth's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been serving as the king's loyal lieutenant in the north of England, governing Yorkshire and the surrounding regions with skill and building a strong base of support among the northern lords. Richard had remained faithful to King Edward throughout all the crises of the previous decades, never wavering in his loyalty, even when their brother Clarence had joined Warwick's rebellion. Now, learning of Edward's death, Richard moved swiftly south to intercept his nephew's party as they travelled toward London. At Stony Stratford, in Buckinghamshire, Richard met the young king's entourage. What happened next would be disputed by different sources, with Yorkist accounts claiming that Richard was acting to protect his nephew from grasping Woodville relatives, while Tudor historians would later portray Richard as a scheming usurper. What is undeniable is that Richard arrested Earl Rivers, Sir Richard Grey, the young king's half-brother, and several other members of the party. He took custody of young Edward and brought him to London, declaring himself Lord Protector and announcing that he would govern the realm until his nephew came of age. Initially, this seemed a reasonable arrangement. Richard was the late king's brother, an experienced administrator and military commander, and the most suitable person to serve as regent for a child king. The royal council accepted Richard's claim to the protectorate, and preparations for young Edward's coronation continued. The boy was housed in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, which served as a royal palace as well as a fortress and prison. His younger brother Richard, Duke of York, was brought from sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, where he had been staying with his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, to join him in the Tower, so that the two brothers could keep each other company and prepare together for the coronation. But as the weeks passed, strange developments began to unfold. On June 13th, William, Lord Hastings, a longtime supporter of the Yorkist cause and one of King Edward IV's closest friends, was arrested during a council meeting at the Tower and summarily executed, accused of plotting against the Protector. His sudden fall shocked the political establishment. Then rumours began to circulate about the legitimacy of young King Edward and his siblings. A clergyman named Ralph Shah preached a sermon at St. Paul's Cross in London, declaring that the late King Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because Edward had already been betrothed to another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, at the time of his secret wedding to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. According to medieval church law, a betrothal was as binding as a marriage, and if Edward had indeed been betrothed to Eleanor Butler, then his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous and invalid. This would mean that all of Edward and Elizabeth's children were bastards with no right to inherit the throne. Whether this claim was true has been debated by historians for centuries. Edward was certainly capable of such a secret betrothal. He had a well-documented history of pursuing women and making promises he did not keep. Lady Eleanor Butler had died in 1468, conveniently unable to confirm or deny the story. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, Robert Stillington, came forward claiming that he had witnessed the betrothal and could testify to its validity. But Stillington's motives were suspect. He may have been acting under pressure from Richard, or he may have had his own reasons for wanting to delegitimize Edward's children. Regardless of the truth of these claims, they served Richard's purpose. On June 25th, an Assembly of Lords and Commons, later called the Parliament of 1483, petitioned Richard to take the throne, arguing that young Edward and his brother were illegitimate, and that Richard, as the only surviving legitimate son of Richard Duke of York and Cecily Neville, was the rightful King of England. Richard agreed, though his acceptance was carefully staged to appear reluctant. A document called Titulus Regius, royal title, was drawn up, setting out the legal arguments for Richard's claim. On July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III in Westminster Abbey. His wife Anne Neville, daughter of the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, and widow of Edward of Lancaster, the son of Henry VI killed at Tewkesbury, was crowned queen beside him. The elaborate coronation ceremonies included all the traditional rituals: the anointing with holy oil, the placing of the crown on Richard's head by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the presentation of the Auburn sceptre, the oath to govern justly and defend the Church. Richard was now the anointed King of England, consecrated by religious ritual and accepted by the political establishment. But what of the two young princes in the Tower? Edward, the deposed Edward V, and his younger brother Richard had been seen playing in the gardens of the Tower through May and June. But as summer progressed, sightings became less frequent. By autumn, they had disappeared entirely from public view. Rumours began to circulate almost immediately that they had been murdered, smothered in their beds on King Richard's orders, their bodies buried somewhere within the Tower's precincts. These rumours would haunt Richard throughout his reign and would form a central part of the Tudor propaganda campaign against him after his death. The truth of what happened to the princes in the Tower remains one of history's most debated mysteries. In 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase in the Tower discovered a wooden box containing the skeletons of two children. These remains were assumed to be the princes and were reburied in Westminster Abbey, but they have never been scientifically examined to determine their age, sex, or identity. Some historians believe Richard ordered the murders, arguing that he could not feel secure on his throne while his nephews lived, and might serve as figureheads for rebellions. Others suggest the princes may have been killed by Henry Tudor after he seized power in 1485 to eliminate potential Yorkist claimants. Still others have proposed that one or both princes may have survived and lived in obscurity. The mystery endures, unsolvable, without evidence that may never come to light. For Elizabeth at Wingfield, watching these events unfold from Suffolk, the usurpation, as the Woodville family and Lancastrian supporters called it, or legitimate succession, as Richard's supporters termed it, meant that her youngest brother was now king, while her nephew had been deposed and might be dead. We cannot know her private thoughts about these developments. Richard had always been dutiful and loyal during King Edward's lifetime. He had governed the north effectively and justly. Perhaps Elizabeth believed his claims about Edward's illegitimate marriage and accepted his right to the throne. Or perhaps she harbored doubts and fears but kept them to herself, knowing that open opposition would be dangerous and futile. What is certain is that Elizabeth's family submitted to Richard's rule. Her husband John, Duke of Suffolk, attended Richard's coronation and continued to serve on royal commissions. There is no evidence that he participated in any of the rebellions that erupted against Richard during the next 2 years. The Duke had built his career on cautious adaptation to changing political circumstances, and he was not about to jeopardize his family by backing the wrong side in the latest dynastic struggle. More significantly for Elizabeth's family, King Richard III named her eldest son, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, as his heir presumptive. Richard's only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, died in April of 1484 at about 10 years old, leaving the king without an heir of his body. Richard might have chosen Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of the executed Duke of Clarence, who had a strong claim by blood. But Warwick's father had been attainted for treason, and there were questions about whether this disqualified Warwick from the succession. Moreover, Warwick was only about 9 years old and reportedly not very capable intellectually. Instead, Richard chose John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, Elizabeth's 22-year-old son. Lincoln was capable, loyal, and of royal blood through his mother. Richard granted him important positions and honours. He was made President of the Council of the North, the body that governed Yorkshire and the surrounding regions on behalf of the Crown. He received revenues from the Duchy of Cornwall, an estate traditionally held by the heir to the throne. Though Richard never formally and publicly declared Lincoln as his heir, perhaps wanting to keep his options open in case he remarried and had more children, everyone understood that Lincoln was being groomed for kingship. For Elizabeth, this elevation must have been both thrilling and terrifying. Her eldest son, the baby she had born when she was barely 20 years old, was now heir presumptive to the throne of England. If Richard died without producing another son, John would become King John, the first king of that name since the disastrous King John, who had lost Normandy and been forced to accept Magna Carta in the 13th century. The de la Pole family, which had risen from merchant origins to ducal status, might now produce a king. But with this glorious possibility came enormous danger. Kings and their heirs were targets. They faced assassination attempts, rebellions, invasions. They had to navigate treacherous political waters where a single misstep could mean death. Elizabeth had already lost her father and 2 brothers to political violence. Now her son stood on the precipice of supreme power, with all the perils that entailed. King Richard's reign lasted less than 2 years, and they were troubled years marked by rebellion and conspiracy. In October of 1483, just months after Richard's coronation, a major uprising erupted across southern England. The Duke of Buckingham, who had been one of Richard's key supporters during the usurpation, suddenly turned against him and raised an army. The rebellion was coordinated with uprisings in Kent, Sussex, Hampshire, Devon, and other counties. The plan was to depose Richard and place Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant living in exile in Brittany, on the throne. But the rebellion was poorly coordinated and collapsed quickly. Buckingham's army was scattered by heavy rains that made the rivers impassable, preventing his forces from linking up with other rebel groups. He was captured and executed. The other uprisings fizzled out. Richard moved decisively to crush the opposition, executing leaders and confiscating estates. The king emerged from the crisis with his position apparently strengthened. But the rebellion had revealed how fragile his support really was. Henry Tudor remained in exile, plotting his return. In December of 1483, he made a public oath in the cathedral at Rennes, promising to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, once he had won the throne. This promise was politically brilliant. By pledging to marry Elizabeth of York, Henry could claim to unite the houses of Lancaster and York, ending the civil wars and bringing peace to England. The exiled Yorkists who hated Richard but had no enthusiasm for a purely Lancastrian restoration could support Henry as a compromise candidate. Through 1484 and into 1485, Richard's regime grew increasingly unpopular. He faced constant rumours and accusations about the princes in the Tower. He struggled with the isolation that came from having alienated the Woodville family and their allies. His queen, Anne Neville, died in March of 1485, possibly of tuberculosis, leaving Richard without an heir and without a wife. Rumours spread that Richard intended to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, King Edward's daughter, to prevent Henry Tudor from using that marriage to legitimize his claim. Richard was forced to publicly deny these rumours, which even his own supporters found scandalous. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor was preparing his invasion. He had secured support from the King of France, who provided money and troops. He had made contact with powerful English nobles, who had promised to support him, or at least to remain neutral. In August of 1485, Henry landed in Wales with a small force of French mercenaries and English exiles. He marched through Wales, gathering support from Welsh gentry, who remembered that Henry's grandfather, Owen Tudor, had been Welsh. Richard raised his army and marched to meet the invaders. The two forces came together at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22nd, 1485. Elizabeth's husband John, Duke of Suffolk, was not present at the battle. He was in his 50s by then and not in a position to lead troops. But her son John, Earl of Lincoln, was there, fighting for King Richard. The battle began early in the morning, with Richard's forces holding the high ground and outnumbering Henry's army. The fighting was intense, with men clashing hand to hand, horses crashing into infantry formations, arrows darkening the sky. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Lord Thomas Stanley, who had been holding his forces back and waiting to see which side would win, decided to intervene on Henry's behalf. Stanley's troops attacked Richard's flank, and the king's army began to crumble. Richard, seeing his battle lost but refusing to flee, made a desperate charge toward Henry Tudor's position, hoping to kill his rival and win the battle through personal combat. Contemporary accounts describe Richard fighting with tremendous courage, cutting down Henry's standard-bearer and coming within feet of Henry himself. But Richard was surrounded, pulled from his horse, and overwhelmed by enemy soldiers. He died on the battlefield, his skull split by terrible wounds, his body stripped naked and slung over a horse to be carried to Leicester. Richard III, King of England, was dead at 32. His body would be buried with minimal ceremony in the Greyfriars Church in Leicester, where it would lie forgotten for centuries until archaeologists discovered it beneath a parking lot in 2012, still bearing the violent wounds he had suffered in his final battle. Henry Tudor was proclaimed King Henry VII on the battlefield. his forces found Richard's crown, which had fallen from his head during the fighting, lying under a hawthorn bush. They placed it on Henry's head, and the Tudor dynasty was born, a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. For Elizabeth at Wingfield, Richard's death meant that she had now lost 3 brothers to violent ends. Her father and brother Edmund had died at Wakefield. Now Richard had fallen at Bosworth. Of the 4 sons born to Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, who had survived to adulthood, only one, King Edward IV, had died peacefully in his bed. The others had all been killed in battle or executed. The Wars of the Roses had consumed the men of her family with remorseless efficiency. Elizabeth's husband John and her son Lincoln both submitted to the new Tudor regime. They attended Henry VII's coronation on October 30th, 1485. Lincoln took his place among the nobles of the realm, apparently reconciled to the Tudor victory. Henry treated former Ricardians with calculated mercy, understanding that he needed to win the support, or at least the acquiescence of the powerful families who had backed Richard. Wholesale executions and proscriptions would only create martyrs and drive opposition underground. Better to offer forgiveness and integration, keeping former enemies under his eye where he could monitor them. Henry fulfilled his promise to marry Elizabeth of York in January of 1486, though he waited until after his coronation to do so, emphasizing that he ruled by right of conquest rather than through his wife's Yorkist blood. The marriage united the red rose and the white rose symbolically, though it could not immediately heal the wounds of decades of civil war. Elizabeth of York, King Edward's daughter, became Queen of England. Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk, was now aunt to the Queen. For several months after Bosworth, an uneasy peace prevailed. Henry consolidated his power, rewarding those who had supported him, cautiously accepting the submission of former Ricardians, beginning the work of governing a war-weary kingdom. But the Yorkist cause was not dead, and many who had fought for Richard at Bosworth had not truly reconciled themselves to Tudor rule. They looked for opportunities to challenge the new dynasty. That opportunity seemed to present itself in the form of a boy named Lambert Simnel. Simnel, probably the son of a carpenter or joiner, had been taken up by a priest named Richard Simons, who trained him to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of the Duke of Clarence, who had a strong claim to the throne by blood. The real Earl of Warwick was held prisoner in the Tower of London, but Simons claimed that the boy in the tower was a fake, and that Simnel was the true Earl. The deception was almost certainly false, but it provided a rallying point for disaffected Yorkists. In March of 1487, Elizabeth's son John, Earl of Lincoln, suddenly fled England without permission. He made his way to Burgundy, to the court of his Aunt Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, Elizabeth's sister, who had married Charles the Bold decades before. Margaret, a fierce partisan of the Yorkist cause, who had never accepted Henry Tudor's victory, welcomed her nephew and agreed to support his plans. Margaret provided 2,000 German mercenaries under the command of Martin Schwartz, a capable and experienced military captain. Lincoln also gathered other Yorkist exiles, including Francis Lovell, who had been Richard III's closest friend and one of his most loyal supporters. With this force, Lincoln sailed to Ireland, where the Yorkist cause had always been popular. The Irish nobility, led by Gerald Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare, welcomed Lincoln enthusiastically. They provided 4,000 Irish troops, mostly lightly armed kerns, but fierce fighters nonetheless. On May 24, 1487, in a ceremony at Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, Lambert Simnel was crowned King Edward VI with great pomp and celebration. Lincoln clearly did not believe that Simnel was really the Earl of Warwick, but the boy served as a useful figurehead, a symbol around which Yorkist supporters could rally. Lincoln's plan was to invade England, defeat Henry Tudor in battle, and claim the throne, either for Simnel as a puppet king with Lincoln as the real power, or perhaps for Lincoln himself. The Earl was, after all, Richard III's designated heir. He had royal blood through his mother. He had as much right to the throne as Henry Tudor, whose claim rested primarily on conquest rather than descent. The Yorkist army, now numbering about 8,000 men, crossed the Irish Sea and landed at Peel Island in Lancashire on June 4th, 1487. They marched east across northern England, heading toward the city of York, hoping that the North, which had loved Richard III, would rise to support them. But York closed its gates. The expected wave of support did not materialize. The people of England were weary of war, and many were willing to give Henry Tudor a chance to prove himself as king. Lincoln's army won a small victory at Bramham Moor, but they were harassed constantly by Lancastrian cavalry under Edward Woodville, brother of the late Queen Elizabeth Woodville. They crossed the River Trent and took up a position on high ground near the village of East Stoke in Nottinghamshire. Henry's army, larger and better equipped, caught up with them there. The Battle of Stoke Field, fought on June 16, 1487, was one of the hardest fought and bloodiest engagements of the entire Wars of the Roses. The Irish troops, lightly armoured but determined, held their ground with ferocious courage. The German mercenaries fought with professional discipline. Lincoln led his men bravely, trying to break through the Tudor lines. But Henry's forces, under the command of John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, who had also commanded at Barnet, were too strong. The battle lasted for 3 hours. When the Yorkist line finally broke, the slaughter was terrible. Henry's forces gave no quarter, cutting down fleeing enemies by the hundreds. The Irish troops fought to the death rather than surrender, falling in heaps. The German mercenaries tried to retreat in good order, but were overwhelmed. At the end of the day, somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 men lay dead on the field. Among the dead was John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, Elizabeth's eldest son. He was about 25 years old when he fell, cut down in the fighting or immediately after. His body was left on the battlefield with the other casualties, probably buried in one of the mass graves dug to contain the thousands of corpses. No proper monument marked his resting place. The family were never able to retrieve his remains for burial at Wingfield with his ancestors. Martin Schwartz, the German captain, also died in the battle. Thomas Fitzgerald, brother of the Earl of Kildare, was killed. Francis Lovell was last seen swimming his horse across the Trent River, desperately trying to escape. He vanished from history after that day. Whether he drowned in the river, died of wounds later, or somehow escaped to live in exile is unknown. Lambert Simnel was captured alive and brought before King Henry. The king, in a gesture of both mercy and contempt, spared the boy's life. Simnel was put to work in the royal kitchens as a scullion, later promoted to falconer. He lived for many years, a curious relic of a failed rebellion, occasionally displayed to visitors as proof of his imposture and of the king's magnanimity. For Elizabeth at Wingfield, the news from Stoke Field was devastating. Her firstborn son, the child she had delivered when she was barely 20 years old, was dead. All her hopes for his future, his position as Richard's heir, his potential marriage to a great heiress, the grandchildren he might have given her, were ended. He had died a traitor's death, fighting against the anointed king in a hopeless cause. We can only imagine Elizabeth's grief. Medieval society expected women to mourn with dignity and to accept death as God's will, but the loss of a child was a terrible blow that no amount of religious consolation could fully ease. Elizabeth had buried her father, 3 brothers, and now her eldest son, all of them killed in the civil wars that had torn England apart for 3 decades. Yet Elizabeth had to continue living. She had 9 other children who needed her. Her husband still required a functioning household. The estates demanded management, and perhaps most crucially, she needed to demonstrate her family's submission to the Tudor regime, to show that despite her son's rebellion, the de la Pole family as a whole was loyal to King Henry. In November of 1487, just 5 months after the Battle of Stoke Field, Elizabeth appeared publicly at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth of York, the former Yorkist princess who was now Henry's wife and England's queen. Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk, walked in the coronation procession carrying the Queen's sceptre, a position of high honour that indicated her reconciliation with the Tudor dynasty. This appearance, so soon after her son's death in rebellion, was both an act of political submission and a demonstration of personal courage. She was proclaiming her acceptance of the new order, protecting her surviving children from the taint of treason. Her husband John, Duke of Suffolk, also participated in the coronation ceremonies. He had not joined his son's rebellion, maintaining the cautious neutrality that had characterized his career. Now he continued to serve on royal commissions and to fulfill the administrative duties appropriate to his rank. The Duke was in his mid-40s, settled into a comfortable middle age, content to manage his estates and avoid the dangerous intrigues that had destroyed so many of his contemporaries. The years immediately after Stoke Field passed quietly for Elizabeth and her family. Henry VII's position grew stronger as the initial challenges to his rule were overcome. He proved to be a capable, if uninspiring king, more interested in building up royal finances and avoiding foreign entanglements than in military glory. His court lacked the magnificence and celebration of Edward IV's time, but the kingdom enjoyed peace and relative prosperity. Elizabeth's children continued to grow and to take their places in the world. Her second son, Geoffrey, had entered the church and was making a career in religious service. Edward, the third son, had also gone into holy orders and served as Archdeacon of Richmond until his death in 1485. Her daughter Elizabeth had married Henry Lovell, 8th Baron Morley, in a match arranged when both were quite young, though this marriage would produce no children, and the young woman would die at about 21 in 1489. Edmund, the fourth son, and now the eldest surviving after Lincoln's death, was emerging as a capable young man with ambitions appropriate to his station. Humphrey had followed his brothers Geoffrey and Edward into the church. Anne would eventually take religious vows and become the prioress of Sion Abbey, one of the most prestigious positions available to a woman in the English church. Catherine married William Staunton, 5th Baron Staunton, another childless match that would end with Catherine's death in 1513. The youngest children, William and Richard, were still in their teens or early 20s, being educated and prepared for whatever futures lay ahead of them. But shadow darkened these peaceful years. In late 1491 or early 1492, when Elizabeth was about 47 or 48 years old, her husband John de la Pole, 2nd Duke of Suffolk, died. He was about 49, having survived to an age that was considered fairly old by the standards of the time, but which was not exceptionally so. The cause of his death is not recorded. Perhaps he fell ill suddenly, or perhaps he had been declining for some time. What is certain is that his death left Elizabeth a widow after more than 30 years of marriage. The funeral would have been conducted with all the ceremony appropriate to a duke's passing. His body would have been washed and prepared by members of the household, then dressed in fine clothing and laid in a coffin. The coffin would have been carried in procession to the church of St. Andrew at Wingfield, the beautiful collegiate church that stood adjacent to the castle and served as the family's burial place. Mourners would have walked behind the coffin, including Elizabeth and her children, all dressed in black mourning clothes. The church bells would have tolled slowly, their mournful sound carrying across the Suffolk countryside. In the church, priests said the funeral mass, with prayers for the Duke's soul and for his safe passage through purgatory to heaven. Elizabeth and the family offered alms to the poor in John's name, a pious act believed to help shorten his time in purgatory's cleansing fires. After the Mass, the coffin was lowered into its final resting place in the family's section of the church. A magnificent alabaster effigy was commissioned to mark the tomb, a carved stone figure of the Duke in full armour, every detail of plate and mail rendered with exquisite skill by master craftsmen. The effigy was placed in a canopied wall niche on the north side of the high altar, where it would remain as a permanent memorial to John de la Pole, 2nd Duke of Suffolk. Elizabeth was now a widow, a position that came with both greater freedom and greater vulnerability than that of a married woman. Medieval widows of sufficient wealth and status could control their own affairs, manage their own properties, and make their own decisions in ways that married women could not. But they also lacked the protection and support that a husband provided, and they could be targets for unscrupulous men seeking to gain control of their wealth through forced remarriage or legal manipulation. Elizabeth chose not to remarry, which was her right under law. She was past childbearing age, and she had plenty of children already. She had no need for a husband's protection. Her status as the sister of 2 kings and aunt of the current queen gave her sufficient standing. She seems to have settled into widowhood with relief, focusing her energies on managing the estates she controlled through her dower rights and on the welfare of her surviving children. But trouble was brewing for the de la Pole family. Despite Elizabeth's efforts to keep them out of dangerous politics, her son Edmund, who had inherited the dukedom upon his father's death, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. King Henry VII was suspicious of anyone with royal blood, and Edmund, as grandson of Richard Duke of York and nephew of 2 kings, was exactly the sort of person who made Henry nervous. In 1493, Henry forced Edmund to surrender the dukedom of Suffolk and accept the lesser title of Earl instead. This humiliation was compounded by financial pressures. The crown demanded large sums of money from Edmund for the restoration of lands that had been forfeited when his brother Lincoln rebelled. Edmund, already struggling financially, found himself trapped in a vicious cycle of debt and royal extraction. The proud Duke of Suffolk had been reduced to an earl, stripped of much of his inheritance, and treated as a permanent suspect by a paranoid king. In 1498, Edmund was involved in a quarrel with another man that ended with the man's death. Whether this was murder or a more innocent case of manslaughter is unclear, but Edmund received a royal pardon. Nevertheless, the incident rattled him. In 1499, he fled to Calais without royal permission. He returned after a few months, but his position remained precarious and his relationship with the king poisonous. The dawn of the 16th century found Elizabeth entering the final years of her life, a woman in her mid-50s who had witnessed more history than most people could imagine in several lifetimes. The medieval world into which she had been born was slowly transforming into something new. In Italy, the Renaissance was flourishing, producing artists and thinkers who would change Western civilization. In Germany, a young monk named Martin Luther was preparing for the religious revolution that would split Christendom. New trade routes were opening to the east. and bold explorers were sailing west across the Atlantic, discovering lands that Europeans had never imagined existed. The old certainties of the medieval world, the universal authority of the Catholic Church, the feudal bonds that tied lord to vassal, the assumption that the social order reflected divine will, were beginning to crack, though few recognized it yet. But for Elizabeth at Wingfield, life continued to follow the familiar patterns she had known for decades. She rose each morning to attend Mass in the castle chapel, hearing the same Latin prayers that had structured her days since childhood. She oversaw her household, directed her servants, managed her estates, and fulfilled the social obligations appropriate to a duchess and a dowager. She corresponded with her children, offering advice and support as they navigated their own lives and careers. She visited with her grandchildren, taking joy in their growth and achievements. She devoted time to prayer and to works of charity, supporting the poor of her parish and contributing to the maintenance of churches and religious houses. The castle at Wingfield had been her home for more than 40 years now. She knew every stone of its walls, every timber of its great hall, every corner of its gardens. The place held memories of her entire adult life, the excitement of her wedding, the pain and joy of birthing 11 children, the quiet companionship of long marriage, the sorrows of losing loved ones. Servants who had known her as a young bride were now elderly themselves, grey-haired retainers who had spent their entire working lives in the de la Pole household. The rhythms of life at Wingfield were as familiar to Elizabeth as her own heartbeat. But even in this peaceful Suffolk retreat, the tensions of national politics could not be entirely avoided. Elizabeth's son Edmund, now styled Earl of Suffolk, rather than Duke, was growing increasingly restless and resentful of King Henry's treatment. The financial burdens the crown had imposed on him were crushing. He was drowning in debt, forced to sell properties and dismiss servants to meet the king's demands. Worse, he lived under constant surveillance, his movements monitored, his correspondence likely read by royal spies. For a proud man of royal blood, descended from Edward III through both his parents, this treatment was intolerable. Edmund had 2 younger brothers who shared his predicament. William de la Pole, now in his early 20s, was a knight living at Wingfield Castle, managing some of the family's remaining estates and trying to maintain a position appropriate to his birth despite the financial constraints that hampered the family. Richard de la Pole, the youngest of Elizabeth's sons, was about 21 years old in 1501, a young man coming into his maturity in a world that seemed to offer little opportunity for someone of his background and bloodline. In August of 1501, Elizabeth's world shattered once again. Edmund and Richard left England without royal permission, fleeing across the Channel to seek the protection of Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor. They made their way to Maximilian's court in the Tyrol, that mountainous region in what is now Austria, and threw themselves on his mercy. Edmund presented himself as the rightful Duke of Suffolk, a prince of the blood royal who had been unjustly treated by a usurping Tudor king. He asked Maximilian for military support to invade England and claim the throne. The flight was facilitated by Sir James Tyrrell, a knight who had served to Richard III and who remained loyal to the Yorkist cause. Tyrrell, who was later accused of murdering the princes in the Tower on Richard's orders, an accusation that may or may not be true, helped arrange the de la Pole brothers' escape. For this assistance, he would pay with his life. King Henry had him arrested, tried for treason, and executed. For Elizabeth at Wingfield, learning that Edmund and Richard had fled to Europe must have been devastating. She had already lost one son to rebellion against the Tudors when Lincoln died at Stoke Field. Now 2 more sons had taken up the Yorkist cause and placed themselves beyond Henry's reach, but also beyond hers. She could not protect them, could not counsel them, could not even communicate with them, except through dangerous and uncertain channels. They were exiles, fugitives, rebels in the eyes of the English crown. King Henry's response was swift and ruthless. If he could not punish Edmund and Richard directly, he would punish those they had left behind. William de la Pole, Elizabeth's third surviving son, was arrested on suspicion of complicity in his brother's flight. There is no evidence that William had any involvement in the plot, or even knew about it beforehand. He seems to have been living quietly at Wingfield, managing the estates and avoiding politics entirely. But his innocence did not matter. He carried royal blood, he was brother to traitors, and that was enough. William was taken to the Tower of London and imprisoned. King Henry made it clear that William would remain there as a hostage for his brother's good behaviour. If Edmund and Richard attempted any invasion or caused trouble for Henry, William would suffer the consequences. This policy of holding family members hostage was not unusual in medieval and early modern politics, but it was nonetheless cruel. William de la Pole had committed no crime, harboured no treasonous thoughts, participated in no plots, yet he would spend the rest of his life in captivity. Elizabeth, now in her late 50s, had to face the reality that another of her sons was lost to her. William was alive, but she could not see him, could not embrace him, could not offer him comfort or support. He sat in a cell in the Tower of London, not knowing if he would ever be released or if he would die there. The Tower had been a prison for centuries, and many who entered through its gates never left except to go to their execution. The political situation grew more complex over the following months. In December of 1502, Edmund de la Pole was formally proclaimed an outlaw at Ipswich in Suffolk, the county where he had been born and where his family had held power for generations. This proclamation stripped him of all legal rights and declared that anyone could kill him with impunity, as one might kill a wolf or other dangerous beast. It was a medieval form of legal death, turning a man into a non-person who existed outside the protection of the law. In January of 1504, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against Edmund, Richard, and William de la Pole. Attainder was the most severe legal punishment available in English law. It declared a person guilty of treason, confiscated all their lands and property, corrupted their blood so that they could not pass on titles or inheritance to their descendants, and sentenced them to death. All three brothers were attainted, even though William was an innocent hostage and had committed no crime. The family's remaining estates were forfeit to the crown. The Dukedom of Suffolk ceased to exist. The de la Pole family, which had risen from merchant origins to ducal status over 3 generations, was legally destroyed. For Elizabeth, this meant not only the loss of her sons, but also the loss of much of her financial security. Her dower rights as John's widow gave her some income, but the bulk of the family's wealth was gone, seized by an unforgiving king who saw threats everywhere he looked. She wasn't reduced to poverty. She retained enough property and income to live comfortably, but the great wealth and status that had been hers as Duchess of Suffolk were greatly diminished. Edmund and Richard remained in exile on the continent, moving between the courts of various rulers who saw them as useful pawns in diplomatic games with England. Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, provided some support, but not enough to mount a serious invasion. He was more interested in using the de la Pole brothers as bargaining chips in his negotiations with Henry than in actually helping them reclaim the English throne. Edmund assumed the title Duke of Suffolk again, refusing to accept his degradation to Earl, and styled himself as the rightful heir to the throne of England. In correspondence and diplomatic documents, he was referred to as the White Rose, invoking the old symbol of the House of York. The exiled brothers attracted other Yorkist refugees to their cause, men who had fought for Richard III, who had lost lands and positions under the Tudors, who believed that Henry's claim to the throne was weak and illegitimate, gathered around Edmund and Richard, offering their swords and their loyalty. They plotted invasions, sought funding from foreign powers, and dreamed of the day when they would return to England in triumph and restore the Yorkist line. But these dreams would never materialize during Elizabeth's lifetime. The months stretched into years, and Edmund remained in exile, dependent on the charity of foreign princes, unable to raise sufficient forces for an invasion. Henry VII proved surprisingly effective at neutralizing the threat. Through a combination of diplomacy, bribery, and threats, he pressured foreign rulers to withdraw their support from the De la Pole brothers. He maintained an extensive network of spies who monitored the exiles' movements and activities. He made it clear that any power that supported the De la Poles would face English hostility. During these final years of her life, Elizabeth lived quietly at Wingfield, far from the courts and capitals where her sons' fates were being decided. She maintained her household as best she could with reduced means. She attended to her religious duties with the increased devotion common among the elderly. Knowing that her own death could not be far off, she worried about her sons, Edmund and Richard in dangerous exile, William imprisoned in the Tower, the others scattered in various careers and positions throughout England. She had her daughters and daughters-in-law to provide some comfort, and she had grandchildren, though the family's political troubles meant that fewer grand marriages were arranged for these younger generations. The De la Pole name, once so proud and powerful, was now associated with treason and failure. Other noble families were reluctant to marry their children to suspected traitors, no matter how distinguished the De la Pole bloodline might be. Elizabeth's health, robust enough to survive 11 pregnancies and childbirths, began to fail as she approached 60 years of age. In the early 16th century, 60 was quite old. Few people lived to see their 60th birthday, and those who did were considered to have achieved a remarkable longevity. Elizabeth had outlived her husband by more than a decade. She had outlived all her brothers. She had outlived her father and many of her children. She was, in some sense, a survivor from another age, one of the last living connections to the Wars of the Roses that had consumed her youth and middle years. We do not know the details of Elizabeth's final illness. Medieval and early modern medical records rarely survive for anyone below the rank of royalty, and even royal medical records are often vague about symptoms and diagnoses. Perhaps she suffered from one of the many infectious diseases that periodically swept through medieval England. Plague, sweating sickness, dysentery, typhus. Perhaps her heart simply weakened with age, a common cause of death in the elderly. Perhaps she contracted pneumonia, that frequent killer of older people in an age before antibiotics or effective treatments. Or perhaps, as sometimes happened, she simply faded away, her body worn out after nearly 60 years of life in a harsh world. Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk, was last mentioned in documents as being alive in January of 1503. By May of 1504, records refer to her in the past tense, indicating that she had died sometime during the intervening months. The most likely date of death is early in 1503, probably in the winter or early spring when illness struck most readily and when the elderly were most vulnerable. She died at Wingfield, in the castle that had been her home for nearly half a century. She would have been attended in her final hours by her household chaplain, who heard her confession and gave her the last rites of the Catholic Church. The priest would have anointed her with holy oil. murmuring the ancient prayers that commended her soul to God's mercy. He would have placed a consecrated host on her tongue, giving her the body of Christ one final time. Family members and trusted servants would have gathered around her bed, witnesses to her passing. Medieval Christianity taught that the moment of death was crucial, determining the soul's destination in the afterlife. A good death, one where the dying person was conscious, able to confess sins, to receive the sacraments, to make final peace with God, was considered essential for salvation. A bad death, sudden, without warning, with no time for confession and communion, was feared as potentially leading to damnation, or at least to long suffering in purgatory. Elizabeth, dying in her own bed with a priest in attendance, achieved a good death according to the standards of her time and faith. When she breathed her last, the household went into mourning. Servants draped the public rooms in black cloth. The chapel bell tolled, announcing to the village and surrounding countryside that the Duchess of Suffolk had passed from this world. Prayers were said for her soul, asking God to have mercy on her and to shorten her time in purgatory's cleansing fires. Alms were distributed to the poor in her name, for charity on behalf of the dead was believed to help them in the afterlife. Elizabeth's body was washed and prepared for burial by the women of the household. She was dressed in her finest clothing, perhaps the same garments she had worn for ceremonial occasions at court. Her hands were placed in an attitude of prayer, and a rosary might have been wound through her fingers. She was laid in a coffin made of wood, possibly lined with lead to slow decay. The funeral procession carried Elizabeth's coffin from the castle to the church of St. Andrew at Wingfield, where her husband's body had been laid to rest a decade earlier. The coffin was borne by servants of the household, walking slowly while mourners followed behind. The church bells rang out, their mournful sound carrying across the flat Suffolk countryside. Villagers would have lined the route, bowing their heads respectfully as their former lady made her final journey. In the church, priests celebrated a requiem mass, the funeral service of the Catholic Church. The liturgy included prayers for Elizabeth's soul, asking God to grant her eternal rest and perpetual light. Hymns were sung, perhaps the Dies Irae, that haunting medieval poem about Judgment Day, or the In Paradisum, the beautiful prayer asking angels to lead the soul to paradise. Incense smoke rose toward the vaulted ceiling, symbolizing prayers ascending to heaven. After the Mass, Elizabeth's coffin was interred beside her husband's in the family's section of the church. A second alabaster effigy was commissioned to lie beside John's, creating a double tomb that would serve as a memorial to both Duke and Duchess. The effigy showed Elizabeth in her Duchess's robes, her hands clasped in eternal prayer, her face carved in peaceful repose. The sculptors worked with skill and care, creating a likeness that captured the dignity and grace appropriate to a woman of her station. The tomb was placed in a canopied wall niche on the north side of the high altar, where it can still be seen today by visitors to St. Andrew's Church in Wingfield. The two effigies lie side by side, John in his armour, Elizabeth in her robes. Below them, carved on the tomb chest, are heraldic shields displaying the arms of their families, reminding viewers of the noble blood that flowed in their veins and of the royal connections that had shaped their lives. Elizabeth died without knowing the ultimate fates of her exiled and imprisoned sons. Edmund remained in exile, moving between the courts of various European rulers, never able to raise sufficient forces for an invasion of England, but never abandoning his claim to be the rightful Duke of Suffolk and heir to the throne. Richard stayed with him, loyal to his older brother and to the Yorkist cause they represented. William sat in his cell in the Tower of London, a forgotten prisoner whose only crime was his bloodline. The news of Elizabeth's death would have reached Edmund and Richard in their exile, though how much detail they received and how they reacted, we cannot know. Letters between England and the continent were uncertain, and communication with proclaimed traitors was dangerous. Perhaps they learned of their mother's passing weeks or months after it occurred. Perhaps they held a small memorial service wherever they were, saying prayers for her soul and remembering the woman who had borne them and raised them. William in the Tower may have been told of his mother's death, or he may have been kept ignorant of events outside his prison. The Tower was not always as terrible as its reputation suggested. Prisoners of noble birth were often housed in reasonable comfort, with servants to attend them, books to read, and permission to walk in the Tower gardens. But they were cut off from the outside world, dependent on the mercy of their jailers for news and for any contact with family and friends. Elizabeth's death marked the end of an era in a very real sense. She was one of the last people alive who could remember the Wars of the Roses in their full fury, who had known the great figures of that conflict personally, who had witnessed the rise and fall of the House of York from inside the royal family itself. Her father, Richard Duke of York, had claimed the throne and been killed fighting for it. Her brothers Edward and Richard had ruled as kings. Her nephews had been deposed and possibly murdered. Her sons had become pretenders and rebels, fighting to restore what had been lost. With her death, that direct personal connection to the mid-15th century was severed. The England of her youth, the England of Edward IV's magnificent court, of Burgundian alliances and trade prosperity, of Yorkist military triumphs, was gone, replaced by the grimmer, more austere realm of Henry VII, where royal suspicion and financial extraction took precedence over chivalric display and aristocratic independence. After Elizabeth's death, her son's stories continued to unfold in ways that would have caused her both pride and anguish had she lived to see them. The De la Pole brothers represented the last serious Yorkist threat to the Tudor dynasty, and Henry VII and his son, Henry VIII, would pursue them with relentless determination over the next 4 decades. Edmund de la Pole remained in exile in the court of Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, for several more years after his mother's death. He continued to style himself as Duke of Suffolk and to claim that he was the rightful heir to the English throne. Maximilian provided some support, but never enough to actually mount an invasion. The emperor found Edmund more useful as a diplomatic bargaining chip than as an actual military ally. In 1506, events took a dramatic turn. Philip of Burgundy, Maximilian's son and heir, was sailing to Spain to claim his wife's inheritance in Castile. His ships were caught in terrible storms and blown off course, forcing him to land on the English coast. King Henry VII essentially held Philip hostage, refusing to allow him to leave until certain conditions were met. One of those conditions was the surrender of Edmund de la Pole. Philip had been harbouring Edmund at his court in the Low Countries, and Edmund had been part of his entourage during the voyage. Now Philip had no choice but to hand over his Yorkist guest. Edmund was arrested and brought to London. Philip extracted a promise from Henry that Edmund's life would be spared. He would be imprisoned but not executed. Henry agreed to this condition, and Edmund was taken to the Tower of London and locked up alongside his brother William, who had now been imprisoned for 5 years. Edmund would spend the next 7 years in the Tower. Unlike William, who had been imprisoned without trial or formal charges, Edmund had been attainted by Parliament and legally declared a traitor. His life was forfeit according to English law, but Henry honoured his promise to Philip and let Edmund live. The former Duke of Suffolk sat in his cell, watching the years pass, knowing that his dream of reclaiming his titles and challenging the Tudors was over. In 1509, King Henry VII died after a long illness. His son became King Henry VIII, a vigorous young man of 17, who seemed to promise a new era of energy and glory for England. Henry VIII was everything his father was not: extroverted, athletic, generous, eager for military glory and international prestige. Where his father had been cautious and penny-pinching, the young Henry was bold and prodigal. But Henry VIII had inherited his father's paranoia about Yorkist claimants. In 1513, as Henry prepared to invade France with a great army, he decided that he could not leave a potential rival alive in England while he was out of the kingdom. Edmund de la Pole, despite having spent 7 years peacefully imprisoned, was suddenly perceived as too dangerous to live. On April 30th, 1513, Edmund de la Pole was taken from his cell in the Tower and brought to the execution ground on Tower Hill. There was no new trial, no formal proceeding. The attainder, passed in 1504, provided all the legal justification needed. Edmund was beheaded on the scaffold, his head struck from his shoulders with an axe, his blood soaking into the wooden platform where so many others had died before him. Edmund was about 42 years old when he died, having spent 12 years in exile and prison. He had been the heir to a dukedom, a man of royal blood with a legitimate claim to prominence and power. Instead, he had become a pawn in diplomatic games and finally a victim of Tudor ruthlessness. His body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower grounds, where many executed prisoners found their final rest. Edmund's death left his younger brother Richard as the sole male de la Pole still free and able to claim the Yorkist succession. Richard had remained in Europe when Edmund was captured, and he had spent the years since building his own career as a soldier and continuing to promote the Yorkist cause. He styled himself the White Rose and claimed the titles of Duke of Suffolk and Earl of Lincoln, though these were empty honours in exile. Richard found employment as a military commander in the service of Louis XII of France. The French kings were always happy to harbour English pretenders, as they provided useful tools for putting pressure on the English crown. In return for French patronage and protection, Richard fought in French armies during the Italian Wars, those complex conflicts that convulsed early 16th century Europe, as France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Italian city-states competed for control of the wealthy Italian peninsula. In 1514, it seemed that Richard's moment had finally come. King Louis XII assembled a fleet of ships and an army of 12,000 men at St. Malo in Brittany. The plan was to invade England with Richard at the head of the army, to land on the English coast, and to march on London, proclaiming Richard as the rightful king. Yorkist supporters in England were supposedly ready to rise in rebellion. French military might would provide the force needed to overwhelm Tudor defences. Everything was prepared, but at the last moment, France and England made peace. Henry VIII and Louis XII signed a treaty in which Louis agreed to marry Henry's younger sister Mary Tudor. The marriage alliance meant that Louis could not simultaneously be invading England. The fleet was disbanded, the army sent home, and Richard's invasion cancelled before it ever began. It must have been a crushing disappointment for Richard, who had come so close to returning to England with an army at his back, only to see the opportunity snatched away by diplomatic circumstances beyond his control. Richard settled in Metz in Lorraine, living as an exile on a pension from the French crown. He maintained a household of fellow Yorkist refugees, men who had lost everything when the Tudors triumphed and who dreamed of restoration. He was visited by spies and agents from various powers, all seeking to use him for their own purposes. Pierre Alamire, a composer and music copyist who worked as a spy for Henry VIII, came to Metz, trying to gather information about Richard's plans and activities. But Richard was wary enough to turn Alamir into a double agent, using him to feed false information back to Henry, while learning what he could about Tudor intelligence operations. In 1523, when Louis XII had been succeeded by Francis I, Richard's hopes revived briefly. Francis agreed to support another invasion attempt, and Richard began recruiting mercenaries and gathering ships. But once again, diplomatic circumstances intervened. England and France made peace before the invasion could be launched, and Richard's plans came to nothing. Richard continued serving in French armies, fighting in the campaigns in northern Italy that characterized the Italian wars. He proved himself a capable and courageous military commander, respected by his soldiers and by his French employers. In 1525, he was serving under King Francis I when the French army met the forces of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at Pavia in northern Italy. The Battle of Pavia, fought on February 24, 1525, was one of the decisive battles of the Italian wars. The French army had been besieging the city of Pavia, held by an imperial garrison. An imperial relief army arrived, and the two forces clashed in a confused battle fought in a hunting park outside the city walls. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, with arquebusiers, early firearms, and cavalry both playing crucial roles. The battle went badly for the French. Their heavy cavalry charges were broken by disciplined imperial infantry and by the arquebusiers, whose bullets could pierce armor. The French army began to disintegrate. King Francis himself was captured, a humiliating blow to French prestige. Among the thousands of French soldiers who died that day was Richard de la Pole. Richard was about 45 years old when he fell at Pavia. He had spent more than 2 decades in exile, the last Yorkist pretender actively seeking the English throne. With his death, the direct male line of the House of York came to an end. A painting of the Battle of Pavia, preserved at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, shows a corpse on the battlefield with the inscription Le Duc de Suffolk dit Blanche Rose, the Duke of Suffolk called White Rose. This artistic memorial is one of the few remaining traces of Richard's existence. Richard's body was buried in the Basilica of San Pietro in Sceldoro in Pavia, a church that also contains the remains of St. Augustine and of the medieval philosopher Boethius. He was given an honorable burial, paid for by his enemy Charles, Duke of Bourbon, who had commanded the imperial forces at Pavia. This courtesy reflects the code of chivalry that still governed relations among the nobility, even in an age of gunpowder and religious upheaval. When news of Richard's death reached England, King Henry VIII reportedly celebrated with bonfires and a special service of thanksgiving at St. Paul's Cathedral. Henry was genuinely relieved that the last Yorkist pretender was dead. For nearly 40 years, from the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487 to Pavia in 1525, the de la Pole brothers had represented a potential alternative to Tudor rule. Henry VII had spent vast sums maintaining spies and diplomatic pressure to neutralize them. Henry VIII had executed Edmund and tried repeatedly to have Richard assassinated. Now, finally, the Yorkist threat was eliminated. But there remained one more de la Pole brother alive, though he posed no threat to anyone. William de la Pole, Elizabeth's third surviving son, still sat in the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned in 1502. He had now been in captivity for more than 2 decades, forgotten by almost everyone, a prisoner whose only crime was his bloodline. The Tower in the early 16th century housed many long-term prisoners of noble or gentle birth. These prisoners were not chained in dungeons or tortured. That treatment was reserved for common criminals and those accused of particularly heinous crimes. Instead, noble prisoners lived in rooms within the tower's various buildings, sometimes with servants to attend them, able to walk in the gardens, to receive visitors with permission, and to pursue various activities to occupy their time. William would have had access to books, perhaps writing materials, possibly musical instruments. He could hear Mass in the tower's chapel. He could look out his window at the Thames flowing past, at the city of London spread out beyond the tower walls, at a world he could see but never enter. The psychological torture of such captivity, to be alive and healthy but imprisoned indefinitely without hope of release, must have been almost unbearable. Year followed year, and William remained in the tower. Henry VII died. Henry VIII became king. Cardinal Wolsey rose to power and fell from grace. England broke from the Catholic Church in the Great Schism of the Reformation. Monasteries were dissolved and their wealth seized by the crown. And still William sat in his cell. He was a living ghost, a forgotten relic of old conflicts that younger generations barely remembered. By the late 1530s, William had been imprisoned for 37 years, longer than any other prisoner in the tower's long history. He was in his 60s now, an old man by the standards of the time. He had spent more than half his life in captivity. His mother, father, and all his brothers, except possibly some who had entered the church, were dead. The world had changed around him, transformed by religious upheaval and political revolution, while he remained frozen in place, neither free nor executed, neither forgotten nor remembered, simply existing in a strange limbo. In 1539, William de la Pole finally died in the Tower of London. The official cause of death is not recorded, but at his age, and after such long imprisonment, natural causes seem most likely. He may have simply succumbed to the ailments of old age, heart failure, stroke, infection, any of the many ways that elderly people died in an era before modern medicine. Some historians have speculated that Henry VIII, in his increasingly paranoid and ruthless final years, may have ordered William's quiet execution, but there is no evidence for this, and it seems unnecessary given William's advanced age and complete harmlessness. William's body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower grounds, joining his brother Edmund and many other victims of Tudor justice. His death closed the final chapter of the de la Pole family's story, the merchant dynasty that had risen to become Dukes of Suffolk, that had married into the royal family and produced pretenders to the throne, was effectively ended. Other branches of the family survived and went on to respectable, if less exalted careers, but the direct line from Elizabeth and John de la Pole was finished. Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk, lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in English history. Born in the midst of the 100 Years' War, she grew up during the Wars of the Roses, witnessed the rise and fall of the House of York, saw the Tudor dynasty establish itself, and died just as the medieval world was beginning its transformation into the early modern age. Her life spanned nearly 6 decades, from 1444 to 1503, and in those 60 years she experienced more drama, tragedy, and historical change than most people could imagine. She was born a duke's daughter, but her father claimed the throne and was killed fighting for it. She married a duke's son whose father had been murdered for political crimes. She became the sister of King Edward IV, then the sister of King Richard III, then the aunt of Queen Elizabeth of York. She gave birth to 11 children, 10 of whom survived to adulthood, a remarkable achievement in an age of high infant mortality. She buried her father, 3 brothers, her husband, and at least 1 son during her lifetime, and 3 more of her sons would die violently or in prison after her death. The de la Pole family's story did not end entirely with William's death in 1539. Though the direct male line was finished, Elizabeth's daughters had married and had children, spreading her blood and that of the House of York into other noble families. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued the family legacy, though with decreasing connection to the royal blood that had defined Elizabeth's generation. The de la Pole family's former estates passed into other hands. Wingfield Castle eventually ceased to be used as a residence and fell into partial ruin. Parts of the castle were demolished, while other sections were converted into farmhouses and outbuildings. Today, little remains of the medieval fortress where Elizabeth spent most of her adult life, though the Church of St. Andrew still stands, and visitors can still see the magnificent tomb where Elizabeth and John rest in perpetual stone slumber. The church itself is a beautiful example of late medieval ecclesiastical architecture, with its soaring tower visible for miles across the flat Suffolk countryside. Inside, the carved wooden screens, the stained glass windows, and the memorial brasses speak to the wealth and piety of the families who worshipped here over the centuries. The de la Pole tomb remains one of the church's greatest treasures. The alabaster effigy still recognizable after more than 500 years, though weathered and worn by time. The tomb serves as Elizabeth's memorial, the physical trace of her existence that survives into our own time. The effigy shows her in her duchess's robes, hands clasped in prayer, her face serene and dignified. The sculptor captured something of the woman's character in the stone. The strength, the dignity, the quiet endurance that allowed her to survive where so many others fell. Below the effigies, the carved shields display the arms of York and Suffolk, de la Pole and Plantagenet, reminding viewers of the noble and royal blood that flowed in Elizabeth's veins. In the centuries after her death, Elizabeth was largely forgotten by history. Her brothers, Edward IV and Richard III, dominated the story of the Yorkist period, their dramatic reigns and controversial actions capturing the attention of chroniclers and historians. Her sons earned footnotes as pretenders and rebels, their failed attempts to restore Yorkist rule noted briefly before historians moved on to describe the Tudor consolidation of power. But Elizabeth herself, the woman who connected these men, who bore and raised the last Yorkist claimants, who witnessed the entire arc of the Wars of the Roses from her unique position as royal sister and mother of pretenders, was overlooked. This neglect reflects broader patterns in how history was written for centuries. Women's experiences were often marginalized or ignored entirely in favor of the stories of kings and warriors, battles and treaties. A woman who did not rule as queen, who did not participate directly in politics, who lived a primarily domestic life raising children and managing estates, seemed to historians unworthy of attention, regardless of how dramatic the events unfolding around her might have been. But Elizabeth's story deserves to be told and remembered. She provides a window into the lives of noblewomen in late medieval England, showing us how they navigated the treacherous politics of civil war, how they fulfilled their duties as wives and mothers, how they coped with loss and tragedy, how they adapted to circumstances beyond their control. Through Elizabeth, we can understand the human cost of the Wars of the Roses, not just the soldiers who died in battle or the nobles who were executed, but the families torn apart, the mothers who buried children, the women who watched helplessly as their menfolk destroyed themselves in pursuit of power. Elizabeth's remarkable fertility, 11 children in 18 years, and the survival of most of those children to adulthood, speaks to her robust health and probably to the quality of care she received as a duchess, with access to the best midwives and medical attention available. But it also speaks to her strength and resilience. to a constitution that could endure repeated pregnancies and childbirths in an age when those processes carried real danger. Her longevity, nearly 60 years in an age when life expectancy was much shorter than today, allowed her to witness the full cycle of her family's rise and fall. She was born when her father was a relatively minor duke with royal ambitions. She lived through his attempt to seize the throne and his death in battle. She saw two of her brothers crowned as kings. She watched the Yorkists cause triumph, consolidate power, and then collapse at Bosworth Field. She endured the early Tudor years, when Henry VII methodically eliminated anyone who might challenge his authority. She died just as the Tudor dynasty was beginning to feel secure, with Henry VIII preparing to become one of England's most memorable monarchs. The Wars of the Roses, which had begun with the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, when Elizabeth was 11 years old, did not truly end until the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, when she was 43. But in a deeper sense, they continued until the Battle of Pavia in 1525, when her youngest son Richard fell fighting for France, ending the last serious Yorkist challenge to Tudor rule. The conflict that had begun before Elizabeth's adolescence did not conclude until 2 decades after her death, a span of 70 years during which England was convulsed by intermittent civil war and political instability. Elizabeth's life bridged that entire period. She personally knew many of the major figures: her brothers Edward IV and Richard III, her nephew, the deposed Edward V, her sister Margaret of Burgundy, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, who was her husband's distant cousin by marriage, and many others who shaped the events of their time. She witnessed major battles and political upheavals, though always from a remove, always as an observer, rather than a participant in the decisions that shaped history. Her political stance seemed to have been one of pragmatic accommodation. When her brother Edward was king, she supported him and benefited from his favour. When Richard seized the throne, she accepted his rule, and her son became his heir. When Henry Tudor won at Bosworth, she submitted to the new dynasty and appeared at Queen Elizabeth's coronation. This flexibility might seem unprincipled to some, but it was actually a sophisticated survival strategy. Elizabeth understood that open opposition to whoever held power was futile and dangerous. Better to bend with the wind than to break. This same pragmatism did not extend to her sons, however. Lincoln, Edmund, and Richard all chose to fight rather than accommodate, to risk everything for the Yorkist cause rather than accept Tudor supremacy. We might wonder what Elizabeth thought of their choices. Did she support their rebellions and plots, even though she kept herself carefully neutral in public? Did she urge them to submit and accept the new order? We cannot know, but the question highlights the difficult position of women in her society, expected to be obedient to male authority, but also expected to guide and influence their sons, commanded to accept whatever political changes occurred, but emotionally tied to family members who refused to submit. The tragedy of Elizabeth's maternal experience, bearing 11 children, only to see 4 of them die violent deaths or in prison, reflects the broader tragedy of the Wars of the Roses. A generation of English nobility destroyed itself in dynastic conflicts that achieved little except replacement of one royal family with another. The common people suffered from the warfare, taxation, and instability. Trade was disrupted, estates were devastated, families were divided. And for what? So that Henry Tudor rather than Richard of York could sit on the throne, so that the red rose could triumph over the white. Yet Elizabeth's life was not solely defined by tragedy and loss. She experienced joys as well. The pleasures of married life with a husband who seems to have been a decent and supportive partner. The satisfaction of raising children and watching them grow. the comfort of deep religious faith that promised redemption and reunion in heaven, the beauty of the Suffolk countryside she called home for so many years, the respect and status that came with her position as Duchess and royal sister. The sources do not tell us much about Elizabeth's personality, her interest beyond the duties of her station, or her inner life. Medieval and early modern records rarely provide the kind of intimate personal details that would allow us to understand historical figures as fully rounded human beings. We know what Elizabeth did, whom she married, how many children she bore, where she lived, when she died. We know less about who she was, her temperament, her relationships, her private thoughts and feelings. But we can infer certain things from the life she led. She must have possessed considerable strength of character to survive so much loss without breaking. She must have been capable and intelligent to manage large households and estates effectively over decades. She must have had maternal warmth and dedication to raise 10 children successfully through the dangerous years of infancy and childhood. She must have had faith, deep, sustaining religious conviction, to endure the tragedies that afflicted her family while maintaining hope for salvation and eternal life. Elizabeth lived in an age that was deeply religious in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. The Catholic Church structured medieval life, providing not just spiritual guidance, but also social services, education, healthcare, such as it was, and cultural life. The calendar of holy days gave rhythm to the year. The sacraments marked life's major transitions: baptism, confirmation, marriage, final rites. Religious art and architecture provided beauty and inspiration. The promise of heaven and the threat of hell shaped behavior and provided meaning to suffering. For Elizabeth, faith was not optional or compartmentalized. It was woven into every aspect of existence. She attended Mass daily, confessed her sins regularly, fasted during Lent and on other prescribed days, gave alms to the poor, supported churches and monasteries, prayed for the souls of her deceased loved ones. When tragedy struck, when her father was killed, when her sons rebelled and died, when her husband passed away, her faith provided comfort and explanation. These events were part of God's inscrutable plan. The suffering of this world was temporary, while the joys of heaven were eternal. Those who had died in God's grace would be reunited in paradise. Whether this faith was sufficient consolation for a mother bearing her children, we cannot know. But it was all that medieval Christianity could offer. And for Elizabeth, steeped in the beliefs of her age, it may have been enough. As you drift towards sleep tonight, dear listener, let Elizabeth's story remind you of the resilience of the human spirit, of the capacity to endure loss and tragedy with dignity and grace. Think of her not as a footnote to her brother's reigns, or as a mere vessel for producing heirs, but as a woman who lived a full and complex life in dangerous times. Remember her long years at Wingfield, raising her children in the quiet Suffolk countryside while kingdoms rose and fell around her. Remember her attendances at court, witnessing the great ceremonies of state while maintaining her own counsel about the political storms that threatened her family. Remember her final years as a widow, watching her sons' fates unfold from a distance, powerless to protect them, but enduring nevertheless. In the church at Wingfield, her stone effigy lies in perpetual prayer, hands clasped, face serene. The alabaster that the medieval sculptors carved with such skill has weathered 5 centuries of English seasons, hot summers and bitter winters, rain and wind, sun and snow. Visitors still come to see the tomb, to read the heraldic shields, to reflect on the lives of the Duke and Duchess who rest beneath. Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk, was not a queen, though she came from queens and bore sons who tried to become kings. She did not wield political power in the way her sister Margaret of Burgundy did. She did not die dramatically in battle or on the scaffold. Instead, she lived a quieter life, managing estates, raising children, adapting to circumstances beyond her control, surviving. And in surviving, in enduring all that fate threw at her while maintaining her dignity and faith, she achieved something perhaps more remarkable than her brother's crowns or her son's rebellions. She was a witness to history, a participant in the great events of her time, a woman who lived through England's transformation from medieval kingdom to early modern state. She saw the end of the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for 3 centuries. She saw the beginning of the Tudor dynasty that would lead England through the Reformation and into the age of Shakespeare and Elizabeth I. She connected the old world to the new, carrying memories of her father's wars into an age when those conflicts were becoming distant history. And now, more than 500 years after her death, we remember her still. We tell her story, we honor her memory. We try to understand the woman behind the titles and the dates. She lives on not just in the stone effigy at Wingfield, but in the historical record, in the family trees that trace her descendants, in the stories that preserve her place in England's long and complex history. So sleep now, dear listener, and let Elizabeth's spirit watch over your dreams. Imagine the quiet beauty of the Suffolk countryside she loved, the stone walls of Wingfield Castle where she spent so many years, the sound of chapel bells calling the faithful to prayer, the laughter of children playing in castle gardens, the gentle rhythms of medieval life. Let these images carry you into peaceful slumber, into rest and renewal, into the soft embrace of healing sleep. Elizabeth has rested these 5 centuries and more, waiting patiently in her Suffolk tomb for her story to be told, for her life to be remembered, for her place in history to be acknowledged. Tonight, we have told that story. We have remembered that life. We have acknowledged that place. And in doing so, we have given her a gift across the centuries, the gift of being seen, of being known, of being honored. May you rest as peacefully as Elizabeth rests, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep profound. May you wake refreshed, renewed, ready for whatever the new day brings. And may you remember, as you go about your waking life, that every person has a story worth telling. Every life has meaning and value. Every soul who has walked this earth has left some trace, however faint, for those who come after. Good night, sweet dreamer. Good night, and thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable life of Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk. Until we meet again in another quiet tale from history, sleep well, sleep deep, and let the gentle whispers of the past carry you into restful dreams. Thank you for joining us tonight on this peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Elizabeth of York, Duchess of Suffolk. If you found comfort in tonight's tale, please consider liking this video, leaving a gentle comment about your thoughts on Elizabeth's incredible resilience through such turbulent times, and subscribing to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical journeys. Until we meet again in another quiet tale from history, sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be as peaceful as Elizabeth's rest in her Suffolk tomb, and may you wake refreshed and renewed.